Goeienaand! Good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And tonight we're going to meet a really remarkable, truly remarkable man, truly remarkable Christian. Let me give you a bit of background. First off, a shout out to Sally Ann, who now lives in Paraguay and with her family. Sally Ann introduced me to Peter, and I understand she will be joining us tonight in the side chat. By way of introduction to Dr. Peter Hammond, I want to tell you an experience I had as a young teenager growing up at Michael House. The priest running the mission for seamen, Reverend Michael Cassidy, was scheduled to give lectures on religious matters in the beautiful school church every night of the week. I went on the first night, a Monday, and noticed just 20 other boys out of a school of over 400 attending, and wondered what it would be like on the final night. This is predictable, as we had to go to church every day and most boys at the school were adverse to spending any more time there. As the week progressed, instead of dropping off, the attendance increased until the last 2 nights the entire school attended Cassidy's lectures. Quite remarkable. Now, let's get on to Dr. Peter Hammond, who's also in the missionary area. He was born in Cape Town and has devoted his adult life to working for our Lord and Savior, Jesus. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a short video where you'll see the kind of work that Peter does. Give me a second while I pull this up.
What can we do? We can be informed, we can be interceding, we can be involved. All of us can do something. We can pray, we can print out and put up the Pray for the Nuba Mountains posters off the Frontline Mission SA.org website. Get hold of the books, Faith Under Fire in Sudan, make them available. Show this film in your youth group, school, church, projects, helping to sponsor Bibles for the Nuba Mountains, or textbooks for the teachers, and textbooks and Bibles for the schools. So we can all do something. Let's see what God wants us to do, but let's pray, let's get involved, let's speak up for the Nuba, speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves.
We would appreciate your prayers for just favor with government officials we may meet, favor in the schools, with the teachers, and then just favor as far as our vehicles, transportation wise.
Also pray for peace in Sudan, because we have seen people suffering a lot.
Okay, that's just a small part of what Peter does. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get Peter on Skype so we can meet Peter and find out about his life story, his remarkable life story, and then about his current projects and his current work. Give me a second while I get Peter online. Hi, Peter.
Hey, good evening. How are you doing, Scott?
Excellent, excellent. Yourself?
Well, thank you.
Great. Now, Peter, what I'd like to do to start off this live stream before we get into the current projects and work that you're doing is a bit of your life, your story, because this is a real people live stream. So what I like to do is to go right back to when you were a young child growing up in South Africa, in Cape Town. Tell us about those times. Yeah, a long time ago. Back in 1960, wasn't you were born? Oh, yeah. But you were born in Cape Town, weren't you?
Yes, but I wouldn't remember that. We left when I was 3.
Okay, well, tell us about early days in Bulawayo.
Right. Good. So, when are we on?
We're on. We're live.
Oh, that was the introduction.
I'll tell you, we've got, at the moment, we've got about 200 people watching the live stream. So, tell me about your early days in Bulawayo.
Well, Rhodesia was just a magnificent country to grow up in. I was brought up with wildlife around, and even though we were actually in the city, my father was a hotel manager. My dad had fought all 6 years of the Second World War in the Royal Artillery as a bombardier, and he had fought mostly in North Africa, 8th Army in Italy, and he could choose to be demobilized anywhere in the world after demobilization. He chose Rhodesia. So my father was demobilized to Rhodesia, and he became the catering manager at the Victoria Falls Hotel, magnificent Victoria Falls Hotel.
I know the hotel.
Within just a few months, he had been out of uniform something like only 18 months, and along came the royal family, and my father said, more terrifying than being bombed in the Blitz, more terrifying than being bombed by the Africa Corps was catering for the royal family at the Victoria Falls Hotel. And that was, I'm sure, one of the proudest moments of his life, even if it was the most stressful.
Yeah.
And being a hotel manager, he moved around a lot, and so I went to 6 different schools and so on. But my teenagehood in Bulawayo was being brought up while my father was running the Bulawayo Club, which was the real social club, and everyone from the Prime Minister, the President, General Walls, the Chief Magistrates, everyone was there, and it would be a who's who. In fact, I remember one time hearing that the Prime Minister is coming to Bulawayo Club, so as a 14-year-old boy, I'd never seen a head of state before, so I was there waiting outside the Bulawayo Club, expecting to see something spectacular, you know, entourage, something like that. And down the road came a beat-up old Peugeot 404, out Ian Smith, and I immediately recognized him from the picture. I mean, I knew this was the Prime Minister, but he didn't have a bodyguard, there was no adjutant, there was no chauffeur, there was no aide-de-camp, there was not a policeman on site. I looked up and down the street, and here was the Prime Minister on his own, 1974, during a war. He's meant to be the most hated man in Africa. He strokes my cat sitting on the wall, smiles at me, and he walks up the stairs, and I'm looking around thinking, where's the entourage? Such a humble, straightforward, normal person. So in Bulawayo, it was just magnificent.
I must tell you a little story. I was in Rhodesia in 1974 on a 7-day holiday. One of those little round-robin tours where you start in Salisbury, went up to Kariba, and then you flew over to Vic Falls, etc. And my first night was actually in Salisbury. And there's a hotel there. I think it's called the Monomatapa. I've forgotten what its name was, but I think it's the Monomatapa. And I spent the first night...
Big, wide, curved side.
Yes. And I spent my first night in Rhodesia at this hotel. It was a Saturday night, and it was about 6 o'clock at night. And I said to the concierge, I said, are there any nightclubs around here? And he said, yeah. He said, there's one just around the corner. And he told me exactly where to go, so I went to this nightclub, and I walked in and entered this huge room, and there were about 200 people in this nightclub. Do you know what was quite remarkable? They were all women. There wasn't one man there, because all the men were fighting on the borders, young men. And I walked into this room, and it's the only time in my life where I've been swamped with women. I mean, move aside, James Bond. It was quite a night, I can tell you. Anyway, sorry, carry on about Bulawayo.
Yes, well, so having a hotel manager as a father, I actually even had for quite a while a lion as a pet. I was very young, about 5 years old, when my father came home with a lion cub, and this lion cub, Dingaka, had been a star of a film, and Juliet Prowse had been starring in this film, which was called Dingaka, which was named after this lion cub, and she was given the lion cub at the end of the film, and for whatever reason she didn't take it with her, whether she couldn't get the papers right or whatever, but she handed this little lion cub to my father, the hotel manager, who brought it home. So you can just imagine the highlight of any boy's existence to suddenly be presented with his own lion cub. So, I must admit, as a youngster growing up with the wilds of Africa, I felt sorry for these poor, bored kids brought up in safe places like Britain and America, and I just thought, who would want to be brought up anywhere except Africa? We've got the tallest animals in the world, the fastest animals in the world, the biggest animals in the world, the most dangerous animals in the world, and I just loved being brought up in Africa and being brought up in Rhodesia. Rhodesia was actually a paradise, and it was magnificent. Now, we were meant to be a country at war, and there were rifles everywhere, and you'd go to the farm, and there would be a rifle by the door, and we were trained from very young not to play with guns and
Right.
to deal with our natural curiosity. I was taken to farm and shown how to shoot from time I was 6 with a 303. Still remember the impact on my shoulder, and that was quite a shock, and didn't know anything could be so loud or hurt so much. But it taught us a respect for these powerful weapons, and the teachers would carry little submachine guns, the row guns, these 9mm submachine guns, and you'd often see mothers in the shops with pistols or with a machine gun over their shoulder, and the farmers all had rifles, of course, and so there were guns everywhere. And even when we went on school outings, like to Mushendijk Bush Camp, which was, wow, that was the highlight for any youngster's life, being taught tracking, anti-tracking, bushcraft by the game rangers. And this is part of our schooling. And again, I just remember feeling so sorry for these poor kids in America and Britain missing out on all this fun.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it was tension for all the adults, but as we're on the roads and they said, you've got to be so alert, we could be ambushed, there could be landmines in the road, and it just made it exciting from my perspective. And at the farm, well, you couldn't switch on the light without closing the curtains. You couldn't open the front door without switching off the lights. You could never frame yourself against the lights. And why are there sandbags outside the windows? Well, it could be RPGs. What's an RPG? And why do we have these funny shields over the windows? Well, that's to prevent grenades being thrown in or petrol bombs. And this was life. But to be honest, I think we felt safer in the middle of the war in Rhodesia than we are in normal life in the cities these days. Because even though it was a war on the go, we had a great police force. We had the British South Africa Police, the BSAP. The army was tremendous, even though it was very much a part-time army.
Right.
Our teachers would be doing, men would be doing half-time in the army and half-time teaching. So you'd have 2 teachers for the same position, same subject in the same year. One of the things that surprised me at school was that we'd have a member of parliament as my history teacher. My first history teacher in high school was Mr. Rhys Davies, and he was great because he'd teach. I remember his first message to us said, beware the victor's version. Never regurgitate the textbook. Textbooks are written by government-appointed individuals to conceal the truth.
Yeah.
And wartime propaganda morphs into peacetime textbooks. He said, politicians lie. He said, I'm a member of parliament, let me tell you, governments lie. You can't trust governments. And I remember saying, sir, if you're a member of parliament, why are you our history teacher? And he said, well, we don't get paid to be members of parliament. It's an honorary position. We need a real job too. And of course, back in those days, the members of parliament would be in parliament something like a few weeks of the year, but the rest of the time they're meant to do real work. And of course, many were also in the army too. And so it was quite extraordinary for me I just grew up thinking it's normal, the town councillors they've got real jobs too, they don't get paid to be town councillors. The members of parliament are donating their time, they don't get paid to be members of parliament. I remember him even saying, when I said, well, do they cover your transport costs? He said, well, theoretically, we get a free train ticket to Salisbury to go to parliament, but if we want to fly, it's on our own account. And things like that. And I remember that was also true in Cape Town, that members of parliament in Cape Town, like Mr. Kent Durr, if he had to go to Pretoria, he'd get a free train ticket, but if he wanted to fly, he'd have to pay for it. And so, interesting how things have changed, aren't they? But I love the freedom. When they speak about born free.
Yeah.
Well, I was born free. We didn't have burglar bars. There was no security gates. In fact, to be honest, I don't know if our doors were ever locked. And if there was ever the front door locked, the back door would be open. And I was never locked out. So I've never experienced what my children experienced, which is being locked out. Because the windows would be open, the back door would be unlocked. There was no burglar bars in the windows. You could climb in. Not that I remember having to climb through a window because the back door was always open.
Right.
And if I saw my father's car downtown in Bulawayo, and Bulawayo was the second biggest city in Rhodesia, we even had a couple of traffic lights. And I remember that if we went downtown and I saw my father's car, I could go, oh, great. If I was carrying a parcel or bought something or some books in the library, I could open the car and put them in the car and shut the car because the car wouldn't be locked. Downtown, the main city. And to be honest, the keys probably were in there too. I'm not sure. I didn't pay attention to that sort of thing. I remember hearing from some people saying, oh, we never took the keys out of the ignition of our cars. Maybe downtown, but, in the driveway it would always be in there. And this is the way it was. There was rifles everywhere, there was pistols everywhere, there were submachine guns in different places, cars, keys in them. And to think that in the time of war we were so safe that I could do anything I wanted, go all over the place, as long as I was home when the sun set. And on Saturdays, I did all kinds of adventures. And I remember one day in particular, I decided to walk to Kami Ruins. Now, I checked this out on the map the other day. 14 miles. It's
Wow.
20 kilometers. I walked from Bulawayo to Kami Ruins on my own. I was 12 years old.
Ah.
I had a pocket knife and I had my water bottle and a hat. And I remembered to put on sun cream, but I never told anyone. My parents said no. I walked alone, and I saw wild animals, not in the game parks, just outside the city limits. I saw giraffe and zebra, and I saw some wildebeest, and it was so exciting. And I explored Kami Ruins, and I came back by the time the sun was setting. My parents never asked where I'd been that day, and we were born free. I mean, what a life, brought up and that kind of thing. So to me, Rhodesia was just magnificent, and to explore Zimbabwe ruins and try and imagine back in the old days what was like originally, and to go to Victoria Falls and Wankie Game Reserve. I must say, I love having been born in Africa, brought up in Africa. Africa's been my home. I'm now 60 years old, but what an exciting, fun time with wildlife. I had a bush baby as a pet when I came out of the army. I must say, it's just so magnificent to have seen. I saw Africa the way it used to be, the old Africa, before the decolonization destroyed the greatest game parks on earth and made some of the most peaceful places of civilization hellholes. Rhodesia was a paradise.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have to say that Rhodesia's got to be was one of the most beautiful countries on earth. As you say, it was a paradise. That was in the days when, it was a sane country. It had a good government, as you've mentioned. There was no corruption. Yes, there were things that were not right when it came to the way people could vote and so on, but basically it was a sound country. Then comes 1980 when Mugabe gets in, and it's rather like what happened in South Africa, and I'd like your comments on this. There was a period of transition after Mugabe took power where it seemed like everything was going to go on as before. But then the power went to his head and he just brought that country down into a complete car wreck. And it looks to me like South Africa is going exactly the same way. After Mandela, you had that transition period, but now it just seems to be, especially now with the censorship now that they've brought in, where you can't talk about the coronavirus and you can't talk about anything negative about the government, otherwise you'll land up behind bars. What are your thoughts about the comparison between what's happened in Zimbabwe in the past and where South Africa is going now?
There are comparisons, but there's also contrast. First of all, many people totally misunderstand Rhodesia and think that Rhodesia was some kind of white minority, white supremacist, oppressive, exploiting or mistreating the blacks. That's not true. Rhodesia never had apartheid. Rhodesia never had racial segregation.
Right.
Rhodesia, in fact, had what they called a qualified franchise. So in Rhodesia, anyone, black or white, could qualify to vote on the same basis. It was either educational qualification, or equivalent of a school leaver certificate, or property ownership. So if a person was a property owner, or if they had a basic level of education, they could apply to vote. And so there were black voters and there were white non-voters.
Right.
And in Rhodesia, in fact, it wasn't a white minority government. It was what was called responsible government, civilized government, and a qualified franchise. And so when Ian Smith was accused of being an apartheid dinosaur and so on, he'd just smile at the BBC interview and so on and say, you don't have your facts. You haven't done your research.
Yeah.
That's not true. And in fact, to look at a Rhodesia system, I must say, I think it was a very wise and balanced one. And in fact, I remember there were black people in the cinemas, there were black people in our swimming pools, there were some black people in my school, to be honest. So in the whole situation when I came to South Africa, I remember being a bit startled by the fact that you had whites only and actual signs, because we didn't have that in Rhodesia.
Right.
Now, of course, the Matabele preferred the Matabele and the Shona and so on, but nevertheless, there wasn't a racial segregation in Rhodesia. And while the whites were conscripted into the army, the blacks volunteered, and yet at the end, I think it was 85% of the Rhodesian army were black.
Wow.
And only 15% were white. That's at the end by 1979. In the police, it was something along the line of 70% were black and 30% were white. So this business of this white army and white police and white government, in fact, the Rhodesian government was heading towards something like a 50-50 parity of white and black in parliament. And then the ANC, that's what ZANU and ZAPU used to be called. Right. They were the African National Congress originally, before they split into ZANU and ZAPU. They started to terrorize black voters, and they started to murder black voters, and they started to murder black members of parliament, black mayors, black town councillors, and so on. And so it's after a while, the Rhodesian parliament got more and more white, not because the whites were excluding the blacks, but because the blacks were being excluded by the terrorists, who were so intimidating and murdering them that many blacks were too terrified to vote or to stand for office. So as time went on, it looked like the Rhodesian government was getting more white, but that wasn't the policy of the Rhodesian government. That was the policy of the terrorists. And again, so I think many people miss that. The other thing that's important to realize is that the Lancaster House Agreement, which I'm afraid the British didn't keep their end of the bargain very well, because the arrangement, what was first organized was Rhodesia had an internal settlement where some of the black nationalists like Bishop Muzorewa and Bishop Sitoli, Ndabazingi Sitoli, and other of Chief Chirao, they came into coalition government. They had one-man, one-vote elections, which Bishop Muzorewa won, and at this point the British were meant to lift sanctions. Lord Carrington of the Foreign Office, who later turned out to actually be a KGB agent of influence, Lord Carrington, who was also head of NATO at one time, managed to talk the Rhodesians into another one-man, one-vote election, this time allowing the terrorists, ZANU and ZAPU, Mugabe and Nkrumah, to also take part.
How did that happen?
At this point...
Why did Ian Smith actually do that? I mean, because he said we're never going to let go.
Exactly, but Ian Smith wasn't Prime Minister anymore, because they had one-man, one-vote elections.
Right.
There was this internal settlement, and you had, then it was called Zimbabwe Rhodesia, Zimro at that stage, and it had a different flag actually as well, and Muzorewa was the president. He got talked in by Lord Carrington and a whole lot of nonsense from the British government. He promised all sorts of things, and I have this straight from General Walls, who was chief of combined operations, who was hearing all this, and the British promising that under no circumstance would they allow that communist Mugabe to take power. This is all designed just to end sanctions, to give a respectability, so Rhodesia, Zimbabwe Rhodesia could be accepted. But at that point, Ian Smith was warning Muzorewa, this is a bad idea, don't do this. Muzorewa allowed the British in and let Lord Soames, who was the son-in-law of Winston Churchill, and a real duplicitous, backstabbing liar of an individual himself. And he came in as governor of Rhodesia, and this was very bad. And everyone from General Walls through to Ian Smith was saying, this is not a good idea. And Muzorewa was just, well, we're going to trust God. But that's fine, but you can't trust the British government. You can't trust the communists, that's for sure, or the Commonwealth. And so it was a 1-2 step approach, and I'm afraid that the Rhodesians, great soldiers though they were, and Ian Smith was a fine man of integrity, but they were outwitted by duplicitous British politicians who lied so convincingly. And I remember saying to Ian Smith, because I managed to meet with Ian Smith quite a few times in the last 20 years of his life,
right.
And we had tea and lunch and supper together and Bible study and prayer meetings, and we discussed things. I interviewed him on radio, and I asked him some tough questions, and I said, Mr. Smith, you're an honourable man, but were you not perhaps too honourable? I said, Mr. Smith, could you not have just accepted one of the British proposals, the Tiger talks, the Fearless talks, the ones at Gibraltar and so on? Couldn't you have just accepted independence on the British terms and then afterwards had a referendum and done what you thought was best for the country? And Ian Smith looked absolutely horrified and pulled himself up to a considerable height. He was a very tall man.
He was.
And he looked at me with shock and he said, oh no, we couldn't have done that. That wouldn't have been honest.
Wow.
What kind of example would that be to Africans? We couldn't build Rhodesia on a lie. And Ian Smith looked at me like, he was shocked that I could come out with something like that. And this is the problem. Ian Smith was an honourable, decent farmer. He wasn't a politician. And he was betrayed, and they ran rings around him, because I'm afraid the British are very duplicitous politicians. I'm talking about the Foreign Office now.
Yeah.
And what they did was outrageous. They betrayed Rhodesia. As Ian Smith said so eloquently in his book later on, The Great Betrayal, we were never beaten by our enemies. We were betrayed by our friends. And Rhodesia put up a superb fight. I mean, 14 years of fighting with the whole world against them under sanctions, where the terrorists outnumbered our armed forces, where they had better equipment and better supplies, and we had one single road across one single bridge, one single railway line as our lifeline to South Africa, and a 78% hostile border around us, Mozambique, Zambia, and even, sad to say, Botswana even was allowing terrorists to be based there, to be used against us. So the situation was very bad. And yet Rhodesia was winning. And in fact, at no point was the Rhodesian army defeated, ever, not so much as a skirmish did they lose. We won every battle. But economically, Rhodesia was being strangled, and there were times that they were running out of bullets, they were running out of petrol, my brother had one of his friends die in his arms waiting for a helicopter, because there weren't enough helicopters or there wasn't enough fuel. And there were times they were having to ration the ammunition because we didn't have as much ammunition as the enemy had. So the situation in Rhodesia was bad, but imagine what the world would be like if, instead of sanctioning and betraying Rhodesia, that the West had stood by Rhodesia. And
exactly.
If Rhodesia had stood, South Africa and Southwest Africa would have still stood, and Africa would be a very different place today.
Yeah. Now, having met Ian Smith so many times, did you ever talk to him about that conspiracy that Henry Kissinger once flew into Rhodesia and had a one-to-one meeting with Ian Smith, which apparently had a huge impact on the future of Rhodesia? Did you hear anything about that?
I did discuss it with him. Of course, he wrote about it in his book, The Great Betrayal, and I read about that, and I discussed with him personally. And he said, honestly, Henry Kissinger came over to him as a really sincere, honorable person. And he said, at the time, he trusted the man. He said that he got the impression that Henry Kissinger was fully on our side, fully sympathized, fully understood. This is what duplicitous politicians do. And I remember, as a young boy, 16 years old, seeing on TV Henry Kissinger look into the camera and say to us as Rhodesians on our TV, the United States government will guarantee the Constitution and the rule of law in Rhodesia, and when it becomes Zimbabwe, and if you go through with the settlement that we've planned with one man, one vote, we will guarantee the protection of your property, your farms will be inviolable, and if any of you choose to leave at any time, although there will be no need to, but if you do, we will compensate and enable you to fully settle up with the same standard of living in another country of your choice overseas. We'll pay for relocation to buy new farms, equipment, everything else. We'll give you the money that you need and so on. You do not need to worry. Your lives will be safe. Your property will be safe. The rule of law will be safe. The United States of America and Great Britain will guarantee it.
Right.
1976, he guaranteed us. And on that basis, Ian Smith accepted the movement towards one man, one vote, which culminated in the elections of 1978, which ended up with that was Bishop Abel Muzorewa becoming Prime Minister of Rhodesia. And then Ian Smith was just one of the opposition members on the side, and one of the front benches. And this was, of course, duplicitous. Of course, Henry Kissinger never meant any such thing, and the United States never guaranteed anything. But there was this 10-year transition period of the Lancaster House where they ensured that things were roughly smooth, but it wasn't really, because even during that time, there were atrocities. There was the massacres of the Madabili, the long fields, as they called them, in Madabili land, and I've been there, I've seen it. I was taken to Attica mine, an antelope mine outside Bulawayo, in Madabili land, where the people said that the army trucks had driven and dumped bodies down these mine shafts by the thousands.
Wow.
And we saw a lot of tire tracks and looked over the edge, and while we couldn't see much, I thought maybe we might have seen something like a body lying over one of the cross beams, but the stench of death just hit you like sledgehammer. There was no doubt. And since then, bodies have been excavated, and the Catholic Bishops' Conference and others have documented. And I think they've got the numbers of over 20-something thousand of their parishioners who were murdered during that time. And some of the statistics go as high as 48, 50,000. Madabili were murdered in 1982 into 83 in the Gukurahundi, the driving rain that drives away the filth, run by the North Korean trained 5th Brigade of ZANU-PF. So even during the so-called 10-year guaranteed, where they were ensuring that the rule of law was maintained under British and American oversight, so to speak, with a lot of foreign aid coming in from America and Britain, even then atrocities were taking place, but basically the whites were left alone. But an interesting thing came out. In 1996, Thabo Mbeki made a statement that they are so grateful to Comrade Mugabe, and actually made this in 1998. 1998, so grateful, the ANC is grateful to Comrade Robert Mugabe for having withheld his land reform policies until after the transfer of power from the Boers to the ANC in South Africa had been completed, because otherwise the Boers would never have been convinced to hand over power to the ANC in South Africa. And so he only started his land invasion policies from 1999 and 2000, by which time South Africa had done their transfer. Now, it's also got to be remembered that South Africa's negotiated settlement of 1994 was a shared settlement. Remember, the South African Prime Minister, Volksvrije traitor, F.W. de Klerk, was one of the deputy presidents. And at that stage, the Mandela presidency of 5 years, the whites still controlled the police, the army, and the economy during Mandela's 5 years. So Mandela was not in a position of total power. He was the figurehead, he was the transition, and that's why in 1999, as Thabo Mbeki came to power, you suddenly saw a purge. A whole of the top echelon of the South African police fired, top echelon of the army fired, and suddenly you saw a whole lot of changes. And that's why from 1999, the real face of the ANC came out. You started to see, as they had removed the transitional time was ensured by keeping the whites in control of the army, the police, and the finances for the first 5 years. And now in Rhodesia, that was done for a degree, because, for example, they still had people like Ken Flower running Central Intelligence Organization, still had General Walls as chief of the army under Mugabe. So the RLI, in fact, still existed for another year after the coming to power of Mugabe. So there was also in Zimbabwe not as long, but a transitional time. But now we see that the reason why they were more restrained in Zimbabwe was tactical. It was because they recognized that South Africa was the big prize, and they had to put up a false front to allay the fears of people in South Africa that, look, we can have rule of law and protection of property, and your farms will be safe and they're not going to be touched.
Right.
It just shows how the communists are much wiser in their policies, whereas many of our people think just 1 or 2 or 3 years ahead, whereas the communists are often thinking generations ahead.
Right. Now, talking about this issue, firstly, I've got to say hi to everybody who's watching. We've got about 300 people watching. I just want to say to you, have you seen that 1993 ANC document that was apparently penned by Cyril Ramaphosa?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, the one where they talk about
the frog in the boiling pot.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And also that they've got to appease the farmers, the Boers, before they can actually do anything. And that ties in perfectly with what you're saying. Now, just getting back to the transition period and moving into how Zimbabwe is a complete basket case now. I mean, there's no question about that. And South Africa appears to be going the same way. What do you think South Africa is going to follow Zimbabwe into complete chaos?
The situation is different. There's similarities, but there's also contrast. Rhodesia, we never had more than 300,000 whites in the country, ever. I mean, that was the maximum. Right now, I don't even think it's 8,000 left.
Right.
And they're economic prisoners and old people who we're trying to help, pensioners who absolutely in terrible situation.
Right.
But the South Africa, of course, has millions of whites. Now, more than half of all the whites in South Africa have already fled. More than half.
Right.
In fact, we had at 1994, when Mandela became president, there would have been something in the region of 5.4 million whites in the country. Now, easily 3 million, if not more, have left the country since then. Now, a few have come back, and of course some others have been born, but when I was born in 1960, whites were 32% of the population of South Africa.
Yeah.
And today, we're about 8% of the population of the country. I'm one of the minority of people in Cape Town who can say I was born in Cape Town. I'm one of the minority of people in South Africa who can say they were born in South Africa. We've got more people living in a country that weren't born in the country than were born. I mean, just think about that for a moment.
Yeah.
So someone like me, who's born here, is considered an expatriate and a foreigner and a colonial and something
settler.
like that by these politically minded leftists. But someone who arrived from Nigeria yesterday is considered indigenous. You see the double standards here. It's quite insane.
Absolutely.
And what we're seeing, and the people who are stealing are calling us, who never stole anything and only built things and gave and sacrificially served others. I mean, just think of myself. I've been a missionary for the last 40 years. I have dedicated my life for the last 38 years of that to running Frontline Fellowship, working across the lines, helping persecuted churches as far afield as Nigeria, Congo, and Sudan. And I have spent a vast amount of my adult life in mud huts and thatched roofs and war zones, even imprisoned and all that sort of thing. And I keep going back. And yet they will call me a racist because I oppose communism. And yet I've never stolen a thing from any black person. I've given them a fortune. Yeah. I've poured beyond calculation the amount of things into building hospitals, schools, churches, Bible colleges, libraries, wells, you name it, helping across the border as far as one can. And what we've done from Zimbabwe up to Sudan and Nigeria over the last 38 years in our mission is huge. And yet, according to the narrative that they give these days, all whites are racists, and no black can be a racist. Even a person like Mugabe, who is the most violent, vicious racist on the planet, no, he's not guilty of racism. According to Thabo Mbeki, who was once president of South Africa, no black person could be guilty of racism, and no white person was not a racist. All whites are racist, no blacks are racist. So how's that for a racist comment? And according to their narrative, all the whites stole the land. Well, there are groups in this country like the Freedom Front and AgriForum who've offered rewards, substantial rewards, for anyone who could point out to one farm anywhere in this country owned by a white person that was stolen.
Yeah.
And nobody's attempted to take up that, because who stole the land? When was the land stolen? From whom was it stolen? How was it stolen? And they can't answer those questions, but it makes a nice narrative. We're victims, meaning black people are victims, and you whites, you're the culprits. It doesn't matter what you've done personally, individually, you're all guilty. And this narrative is coming from people who are raping, murdering, stealing, invading, and they are basically projecting their character and their guilt upon the people who are their victims. Yeah. And it's actually brilliant psychopolitics. And if a person doesn't understand the term Stockholm Syndrome, it's worth looking into, where a victim of a kidnapper begins to depend upon that, begins to think that their very livelihood and survival depends upon the goodwill of the hijacker. So they begin to project onto the kidnapper and the abuser good motives, and they see themselves as being guilty, and somehow the kidnapper is the good person. And it's like an abused wife who tries to defend their husband. No, I slipped, I walked into a pole, I fell down the stairs. Well, they explain the bruises and the gashes, and it's not their fault. And aside from Stockholm Syndrome, there's another good term, and that's gaslighting. And if you've ever seen the film by Ingrid Bergman, Gaslighting, it's actually in the English dictionary since that film, brilliant film, where a woman is abused by her husband, but made to feel like she's to blame, and made to feel like she's losing her mind, and made to feel that he's noble, and she keeps making excuses for him. And so that you use the term gaslighting, where an abuser manages to get the abused to blame themselves. And that's what I see happening in a lot of South Africa. Many white South Africans are Stockholm Syndrome, gaslighted, guilt manipulated, where they're believing the propaganda, and they are some of the most vicious people in turning to any other white who tries to just say the obvious and say what you can see, and you report things. I've been astounded when I started coming back from communist Mozambique, 1982, 83, 84, and speaking about burned churches, the massacres, the hideous atrocities done by Frelimo communists in Mozambique. And I was berated, and I was called before my congregation and denomination, with the president of the Baptist Union even being present, berating me, saying, we're trying to get South Africa to go the same way as Mozambique, and you come along, Peter Hammond contra mundum, trying to tell people that black governments can be a precedent on us. Excuse me, I'm talking about red governments, I'm talking about communist governments, I'm not talking about it racially. And, shut up, you're not listening to us. This is the thing. Everyone wants this country to go the way of one man, one vote, and you're undermining it by... So I'm speaking about persecution of the church. Hundreds of churches have been burned to the ground. Christians have been crucified and enslaved, tortured. It doesn't matter. They didn't care about black people in Mozambique. They didn't care about the Madabili being massacred in Zimbabwe. They didn't care about what was happening to the Okavongo people and Chokwe people and Lavali people and the Ovumbundus in Angola either. They didn't care about anything, because let's face it, just like in America, people in America had to care about what Americans were doing that was wrong in Vietnam and Laos, but you couldn't care about the Vietnamese and Laotians and Cambodians being slaughtered by communists. Nobody cared about that. And that's totally irrelevant, isn't it? And it's this kind of narrative where they don't care about lives, they don't care about people, they don't care about human rights, they don't care about anything. All they care about is the revolution. And the issue is never the issue. The issue is just a cover for revolution. And they're trying to, their agenda is to promote the revolution. And those of us who stand up against the New World Order or the revolutionary goals, whatever those goals may be, which at the moment is expropriation without compensation, or you all got to get vaccinations, you all got to be on lockdown, martial law, and if you say anything against it, we'll say that you've got the virus and we'll just take you away and throw you into some asylum or something. So you can see the way it's going. When I was growing up, we all understood that freedom of speech was essential to freedom. Freedom of thought was essential to freedom. Freedom of association, freedom of the press, freedom of conscience, freedom of worship. You would have thought freedom of religion. All these freedoms are essential, you would have thought. And liberals used to say that. Today, they don't want any freedom. They're trying to call free speech that they don't like hate speech. And now, of course, they can try and turn to medical crisis and just stamp all over the Bill of Rights and Magna Carta. But I'm concerned as a person who's brought up in a war zone. Now, I've lived through two revolutions, Rhodesia's, Zimbabwe's and South Africa's, and you could say even a third one in Southwest Africa, the country where I fought in the South African Army. Southwest Africa's today Namibia, and although that was a different type of revolution, you could say I've lived through three revolutions in my lifetime, and one is traumatic enough. And we're still living through it, because right now South Africa is going through the second phase of the revolution. The first phase of the revolution is when they gain political control. The second phase of the revolution, which you see it in the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Chinese, there's always a second phase somewhere around 20 years later, when they then go for the land and everything. Basically, the second phase is when they seek control over every single aspect of life, total control. In China, that was the Cultural Revolution and so on. So we've seen this in Zimbabwe, such as in the year 2000, they suddenly start the farm invasion sites. And so at the moment, South Africa, they're a bit stalled. We've held them up, we've thrown a few spanners in the works of their machine. But basically, we are heading into what they call a second phase of the revolution, and it would seem that even places like America and Europe, I don't know what it's like in Australia and New Zealand, but I'm getting the impression that all over the world right now, we've got a New World Order move where this lockdown is actually a lock-up martial law, moving into another phase of the revolution where people's freedoms are going to be dramatically curtailed and seeking to advance the aims of globalization of the New World Order.
I totally agree with you. And there are a couple of points I'd like to raise, because I really finding what you're saying is so fascinating and so spot on. Tomorrow night at 8 p.m. I'm hoping to be talking to Chris Dunn. Now, Chris Dunn, his family, going back in KwaZulu-Natal, owned large farms. those farms have been occupied in recent years by squatters, and the ANC government have done absolutely nothing to remove them, and their farms are now basically they still have the title deeds, but they're now basically occupied by blacks who just squatting on their farms, and the government's done nothing about it. And tomorrow night at 8 p.m. I'm hoping to have him on. But I want to get back to I think a critical point here that I see is that there's actually a hierarchy within we talk about the black population, the disadvantaged black population. What you've got is, it's like a two-tier system. You've got what I call black privilege, which is the top politicians, their family, their friends, their contacts, the well-connected, who are getting all the spoils. And then the rest of the African population, the black African population, their standard of living is actually going worse and worse and worse and worse than it was pre-1994, because the ones with the black privilege at the top are stealing everything. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, BBBEE, broad-based black economic empowerment. That's the word they use now for affirmative action or racism in this country. It's a colossal cover for colossal theft and looting of the country. Now, the situation is actually quite desperate. Just to put it into numbers, in 1994, when Mandela became president, we had 70,000 white commercial farmers, 70,000. And they were feeding 100 million people. Now, at that stage, South Africa's population was 28 million. Now, that's pretty good. Our farmers, just 70,000 of them, were feeding 4 times the population size of South Africa. So they were feeding people as far up as the Congo. And today, we don't even have 26,000 white commercial farmers left, not 26,000. But our population's more than doubled. We about 60 million people in the country now. So the population's doubled, but the number of farmers has been cut down to close to a third of what it was just 25 years ago. So the situation is quite desperate. Now, those 26,000 farmers are still feeding 40 million people, but that's 20 million too short. South Africa's 60 million, and we're only feeding 40 million right now. And I don't even know how they're doing that, because it gets worse and worse. You know that the white South African farmers are being murdered at such a rate that it's basically the most dangerous occupation in the world today. If you would think, what's the most dangerous occupation in the world? It's not being a bomb disposal expert in Afghanistan. It's not being anything that you might think in Syria. It's being a white farmer, a commercial farmer in South Africa. That's the most dangerous occupation in the world. It literally is. And to say that they're being murdered would be a gross understatement, because we're talking about torture to death. And I don't want to use too many hideous terms, but people being tortured to death over hours with buzzsaws and boiling water and skin peeled off. And you just can't imagine the disgusting demonic things that some satanic individuals are doing on farmers. And they are being encouraged by government. Now, when Cyril Ramaphosa a couple of weeks ago said that this coronavirus, COVID-19, is the greatest threat to our democracy, I could only snort in indignation at what a blatant lie. But Cyril Ramaphosa is good at broadcasting blatant lies, like when he said there's no farmers being murdered in South Africa.
We call him Hippo Eyes. We call him Hippo Eyes here on the channel. So carry on. This is a hyper lie indeed, and the hippo lie, well, maybe that's a bit unfair on the poor hippopotamuses. But
imagine if the Southern government acted with the decisiveness that they've acted on this so-called COVID-19 pandemic panic against farm murders or crime,
exactly,
or corruption. Or there's so many things that I would say there's 100 greater threats to South Africa's democracy that this government's tolerated and not dealt with decisively at all. In fact, as far as this goes, we've got to remember that we didn't have much of a farm murder problem until the commandos were disbanded by Thabo Mbeki, who promised alternative farm protection methods, which were never forthcoming.
Right.
But that's another story. So just take this. We're talking about over 4,500 farmers and their family members being tortured to death out of a small community.
It's crazy.
Small community.
It's crazy.
So you can just imagine this. This is absolutely catastrophic. And to to be killing off the food supplies of a country is suicide. It's economic suicide, quite aside from the humanitarian evil that it is. And of course, all of these things, the crime rate in the country, the murder rate and so on, is chasing away investors. It's chasing away job creators.
Yes.
It's chasing away tourists. Well, because tourists even getting murdered, and that's not good for public relations either.
Right.
So right now, the situation in the country is, my last statistic, and it's a couple of years old to be honest, is since 1994, 850,000 South Africans have been murdered. 850,000 murdered.
Wow.
In the last 25 years. I think it's more than that because this is an old stat. It's at least a year old. Nevertheless, and of those, something in the region of 88,000 are whites, which is totally disproportionate to the population.
Absolutely.
And so to say that there is an attempt at genocide on whites in this country is very justified, because we've got people from the very top singing, kill the Boer, kill the farmer, members of parliament, heads of government, even presidents of this country have been standing singing with their fists raised up, kill the whites, kill the whites. Videos of these exist. You can find them. There's YouTube examples, documentation, but I mean, there's no doubt. And of course, if anyone doubts, they should see the documentations done by Kate Hopkins and by that Canadian lady as well on farmlands and the murders of farmers in this country. It's well documented. But aside from that, let's just take corruption. According to the African Union, now I don't think the African Union is the most exemplary organization on the planet,
right,
but let's just take the statistic. Still, the AU's Task Force on Corruption has published that 32%, it used to be 25%, but last year they upgraded to 32% of the total GDP of Africa.
Wow.
Gross domestic product of Africa is stolen by corruption every year. Now, let me just spell it out in case someone missed it. 32%, that's a third of the gross domestic product of Africa, is stolen by governments every year. And for those who are trying to keep track, that's more than 12 times, that's 1,200% more than all the foreign aid that Africa receives. So Africa doesn't need foreign aid if they just cut 10% of the corruption. Just 10% of the corruption would equal all the foreign aid, which is already in the billions. But to understand now, we're not talking about taxation, which most of which is theft as well. We're not talking about inflation, which is a hidden tax. We're just talking about what the African Union details as corruption. 32% of GDP. Now, what does that work out to in South Africa? We're talking about trillions of rands are stolen by the government every year. You know, when you hear that 139 billion rand was stolen from Eskom by its high-up officials, that sounds bad, but, you know.
It's a drop in the bucket.
It is. When you're talking about SAAs looting, or any of the other parastatals which the government owns, they've bankrupted everything. They've looted SATV, Eskom, Telkom, Armscor, you name it. And there's so many people still worked up about Jacob Zuma's 260 million in Kandla. Well, that's not even petty cash in the scheme of things. And when this government talks about increasing taxes, this, that, and the other, or whatever, they don't need to increase taxes. All they need to do is recoup what has already been stolen. And now you've got all these people in South Africa, and I'm talking about a lot of whites, friends of mine even, praising Cyril Ramaphosa to high heaven. Oh, what a decisive president, what a wonderful man. I've heard people saying, we have the best president in the world. Cyril Ramaphosa is so decisive, we're proud of him. He saved this country. This is the kind of rubbish you're hearing from people. Yeah. I can just say to them, you know, you must be watching SATV, because if you're paying attention to what's going on in the country, you wouldn't come out with that. This is what people are just paying attention to propaganda come out with. But this Cyril Ramaphosa, he's had 2 years in power. Can anyone name one single ANC official who's been fired, prosecuted, imprisoned? Can he point to any money that's been recouped of the billions, trillions that have been stolen, looted by his people? No. In fact, worse than that, even Thabo Mbeki, who's not my favorite president, in fact, I think he's one of the worst presidents we've ever had. Although most people miss that, I'd say that Cyril Ramaphosa is trying to be worse than Thabo Mbeki, but
he's working
he's
at
certainly
it.
a better communicator.
Right.
But Thabo Mbeki even said that he could not vote for the ANC in the last election that we had last year because it amounted to placing proven criminals back into office. Now, that's what a previous ANC president, Thabo Mbeki, said about the list that Ramaphosa approved of, who is top in the list all the way down, according to the percentage of the votes that the ANC get, because we work on a percentage basis here. And Thabo Mbeki said, this list is just a list of criminals who've been proven to be guilty of corruption that we meant to put back into office where they can steal more. So I've deliberately quoted from my enemies because some people might question, well, if Peter Hammond says that, well, he's an enemy of the ANC. But when the ANC's own people are saying that, I think, hostile witness is pretty convincing. Those are the numbers. Trillions stolen in corruption, tens of thousands of people murdered. We're talking about a situation where, yes, we do have more whites in this country. We have a lot of people who've got ex-military experience. We've got a lot of firearms legally owned by many people around this country, hundreds of thousands, in fact. And so I'm sure the ANC would like to do in South Africa what was done by Mugabe in Zimbabwe, but he's facing more obstacles. We have more weapons, we have more radio stations, we have social media, we have a better form of communication. Everyone's phone is now a camera as well. And so the situation that we've got in this country with the networking and so on is that, they may not be able to do what they wanted. And I've forgotten one thing. Let me throw one other statistic in, which should shock anyone. In 1994, when Mandela became president of this country, we had an unemployment somewhere in the region of 2.4 million people.
Right.
And people were saying this is terrible. Now, of course, that's after decades of war, conscription, strikes, stayaways, no education without liberation campaign, burning of thousands of black schools, and all of that which was done by the ANC and the UDF and so on, and all of the destruction of the economy and the disinvestment. We had 2.4 million unemployed. In fact, people like Desmond Tutu were saying, the moment we have one man, one vote and abolish apartheid, we're going to get all this investment and there'll be no more unemployment and there'll be no more crime, and everyone, you remember those stories about how wonderful it's going to be, which would have been nice. Now, without a war, without the sanctions and disinvestment, with massive international foreign aid, the ANC has managed to add 1 million unemployed to those ranks every single year it's been in power. So we now, instead of having 2.4 million unemployed in the country, we've got 30 million unemployed. That means in the 26 years the ANC been in power, they've managed to add another 27 million unemployed to the ranks. You've got next to no chance of being employed when you graduate from the schools and universities in this country. In fact, they say in South Africa, you've got a woman in this country, a black woman's got more chance of being raped than he has of learning how to read. And this is the reality of Mandela and Mbeki's and Ramaphosa's ANC run South Africa. They have wrecked everything in what was a magnificent country, the jewel of Africa. They've taken the greatest economy in Africa, and by chasing away millions of job creators and millions of employers, they have doomed 30 million people in South Africa to the degrading position of being unemployed or economically inactive or discouraged work seekers. They've broken up the unemployed into three categories, which all means the same thing: economically inactive, discouraged work seekers. What's a discouraged work seeker? Unemployed. Those three categories, if you add them together, you get 30 million. So everything the ANC does, and this COVID-19 psychosis, hysteria, pandemic, plandemic, panic, shutdown, lockdown, is going to put millions more unemployed. And so the ANC keeps blaming apartheid for things when we didn't have those problems under apartheid. In fact, I was a critic of apartheid coming from Rhodesia. I thought that the ANC's, that the National Party's policies of apartheid was not wise, and I thought they should have a qualified franchise. I didn't support the idea of race-based anything, and I still don't. So I was one of the critics, and I was looking forward to some improvements. Being an English liberal, we somehow thought that we had better policies. And so imagine how disgusted I am that this situation has gotten worse. You would have thought no sanctions, massive foreign investment, not that I think overseas foreign aid's needed at all. We could do everything on our own as a country, but to have taken a totally self-sufficient, country that led the world in heart transplants, produced some of the finest equipment in the world. Think that countries around the world like America were buying our weapons, their Apache helicopters, our Roycat. They even had to buy G5 and G6 155 howitzers because we had the best in the business when they had the Gulf Wars. So South Africa led the world in a lot of technology and science and medicine, and today, it's embarrassing. They try and turn us into a third world country, and it's disgusting.
Right, I totally agree. Now, it's interesting that we're talking about this because on Sunday night I'm talking to two doctors who are young doctors. There's a white lady and an Indian lady who've had to literally study abroad because when they finished their matric here in South Africa, because of the previously disadvantaged situation now in universities, black Africans who had far lower marks than they did were accepted while they were rejected from access to the university to study medicine. That's why they had to go overseas. It's a very, very disturbing story when you consider what's going on right now in South Africa, where there's a huge shortage of doctors. There are hundreds of doctors like these two doctors who cannot practice in South Africa now, even though they are qualified doctors, because they had to go overseas to qualify. And the South African government, the HCPSA, which is basically the health practitioners of South Africa, which is run by guess who, are making it very clear, making it very sure that they can never practice in South Africa after they've done the hard yards and trained overseas or got their degrees overseas.
It's vastly worse than that. It's insane. And in doing this, and every single thing they do on this BBBEE, they are impoverishing the poor even more. They're stealing from the most vulnerable people on the planet because the very ones who meant to provide the services to them are being stolen from them, which is resulting in greater unemployment and more people dying in hospitals than need to, and so on. So, for example, I'm one of the previously advantaged, they says. Right. So, how was it when I was previously advantaged? We got caned at school. We got conscripted in the army. We did rock PT. We were shouted at, sworn at, beaten, and all of that in the army, and then had to go and to a place where people were trying to kill us, and bullets passing over your head and all that sort of thing. So that was being previously advantaged. Blacks were not conscripted, and they weren't treated with the same strictness at schools that we were. Now, I got converted. I want to be a missionary. I went to theological college. So now I'm talking about 1982. 1982, heyday of apartheid, you would think, if you believe the propaganda. Actually, right. Not in Cape Town. Cape Town, they had opened the beaches up and all this a long time before. In fact, Sea Point, they didn't even have, I think we didn't have any apartheid on our in Cape Town effectively already from time I came down from Rhodesia. So already late 70s, Cape Town was pretty much a multiracial area. And the Navy had already abolished apartheid and racial segregation in 1974, the police in 76, the army at least by 78. When I was in the South African Army in 1979, we had integrated military units, like 3-2 Battalion up on the border. I was with 201 Battalion, others where you had Bushmen and Rambos and whites working together, 101 Battalion and so on. So the army was, even then, Southwest African Territorial Force was easily 80% black volunteers, while the whites were conscripted. So I go to theological college now, and I'm too male and too pale in 1982 to get a bursary because those only go to black and colored people. So all the blacks and coloreds at college, and by the way, being the white racist from Rhodesia that I chose not to study at the white theological college of the Baptist Theological College up in Joburg. I chose to study in the colored theological college in Cape Town. I thought I'm studying for mission, so I might as well study in a multiracial situation. Early 80s, that was suspicious enough for me to get a visit from the security police and National Intelligence Service and military intelligence to want to know what I was doing, because was I commie butty, was I red, was I, where was I coming from? So I had to work to put myself through theological college. So I worked in the fire brigade. 8 hours a night, 6 days a week. And I did the midnight shift so that I could be at college from 8 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon each day. And so I was midnight shift every night for 6 days a week. And that funded me through college. Now, the blacks and coloreds in my college, they didn't have to work. They would do 4 or 5 subjects a semester. I never did less than 8. I once did 9 subjects in a semester because I was paying for it and I wanted to get as much as possible and finish as quick as possible. And yet out of these students who were doing 4 subjects a semester coming to me who were doing 8 and saying, could you do my sermon at this church on Sunday? I've got an assignment on Monday. Well, I had 2 assignments on Monday, but sure. And so I would average 80 or 90 sermons, church services in a given year at college while I was doing a full-time job.
Wow.
I'd also swap so that I was generally getting someone else to do my Sundays shift so that I could be able to attend services and all this. So I funded my way through college. Now, as I'm going through college, now remember we're talking about 1980s, I'm looking at some of the assignments that others are doing because some come to me and ask me to, proofread and help them. And so I'm fairly familiar of what other people are putting up. So I went to the principal and I said, "Sir, are we all judged on the same standard?" He said, "Oh, no." I said, "Well, how are we judged?" He said, "Well, I give you a percentage based on the percentage that I think you're capable of, and I judge some of these other students on the percentage of what I think they're capable of." So I said, "So our degrees don't actually equal the same?" He said, "Well, in most people's minds, it'll all be the same, but no. We are differentiating what we think the individual students are capable of, which explains why some people passed." I remember on one occasion, the principal standing before the whole student body at chapel and saying that a certain individual who had been expelled for moral reasons would not be graduated on the graduation service that was coming up later that week, because a theological degree is not just academic, it also indicates moral and integrity standards, and said just as you can't be a chartered accountant if there isn't complete financial integrity, so in the ministry there must be complete moral integrity and of course doctrinal fidelity and so on. I thought, brave principal, and good to see there's principle here and there's standards here. Imagine my shock when I saw the same individual, which had been dishonorably excluded from the college, expelled from the college, graduated by the same principal. So I went to the principal after. I said, "What happened?" And he was obviously very embarrassed and angry, and he said, "I was forced by the board to graduate him because they feared a racial incident being made of it." Now,
Wow.
That's the previously disadvantaged. Honestly, I mean, I could give other examples, and others could too, but I think the whites have always been the disadvantaged. We had to pay the taxes, and the black and colored people got the privileges and services and the free things. We had to not only pay the tax, we had to then pay for education, pay for our medical and everything else. I didn't get anything free. As a white, I had to do it all myself. Nobody gave me anything free, and I didn't get a free education. And so even under apartheid, the black people and the colored people were preferred. They were being given better, more, free, and they got every break, and they were being given everything free right from the earlier stages, including, I saw at the college, free accommodation, free food, free everything else, textbooks, uniforms, the lot, while I had to go and earn and work and lose sleep and fight myself. I didn't mind it. I still don't mind it. But what I do mind is when people come out with a total false narrative and now suggest that you whites stole everything.
Yeah.
You privileged situation. You used to get everything good. Well, now we've got apartheid reversed. No, listen, if this was apartheid reversed, we'd be given our own homelands, where no one else would be allowed to own anything. We'd be given our own parliaments, we'd be given our own hospitals, our own sports stadiums, our own swimming pools and so on, which we wouldn't have to pay for. And, you know, we don't want that. We don't want anyone to give us anything for free. We just want to be left alone to rule our own lives and to make our own things. But when they speak about how the old apartheid government or the old Rhodesian government deprived black people of education, that's such a lie. They were given better and more than now. And even the Minister of Education in this country a few years ago had to admit that what we've got now is worse than what they used to get want education under apartheid. And yes, it is worse. You've got 140 kids in one classroom with barely 30 desks.
Crazy.
And holes in the roof, rain pouring in, broken windows, no textbooks arrive all year, and all these sort of things. And you don't even want to talk about their so-called toilet facilities in many of these schools. In fact, according to the Department of Education's own reports, 85% of all the schools in South Africa are dysfunctional.
Yeah,
now that's their own standards, their own report. So, basically the entire narrative, I can put it to you like this. If anyone wants to know the truth about South Africa, whatever the official narrative is of the ANC government, take a 180-degree position, and that's pretty much likely to be the truth. They're lying about everything.
Yeah. Now, I've got to tell we've got about 400 people watching at the moment. If you would like to ask questions of Peter, please, if my moderators can just copy them, and we'll take those questions shortly. But, one thing that we haven't covered yet, Peter, is you converted to Christ in 1977, and you've worked in Scripture Unions and Hospital Christian Fellowship. And tell me about that transformation that happened in your life in 1977, and your drive now. I mean, you work basically solely with the underprivileged black community around Africa. So you have a very good understanding of what's going on. What actually drove you to get involved into this sort of work?
Yes, well, first of all, my mother and father always were very respectful of the local Matabele people. I remember people coming to my mother at night because they knew she was a medical nurse, and needing medical attention, things need to be sewed up and whatever. And so, in fact, one time I remember someone coming to the back door, and I was only about 6, but I remember he had an axe stuck in his head, literally. And he came to the back door and he said, "Madam, I need some aspirin for the headache." And sat down in the kitchen, by the kitchen table. My mother gave him some aspirin, and then she carefully, with bandages, she removed the axe. And the man was fine until he saw some blood, and then he fainted as he saw some of his blood fall on the table. But that stuck with me. But my mother and my father always had time for the local Matabele and the Zulu people and whoever they had to care for. So I was brought up to have this white man's burden that you're responsible to help these people. They don't have everything we have. They don't understand things as we do. We must help. And so, for example, my wife was brought up in Austria. She was born in Europe and brought up in Austria. So when my wife came here, she'd be aghast at these people looking healthy, coming to the gates or the door and asking for food or something. She's like, she'd be ashamed of herself begging, And she'd shut the door on them at first, because she was brought up in Austria where they had a work ethic, and, what do you mean? If I answered the door, I'd get them food, I'd help them, I'd, listen sometimes to their problems and even pray with them if needed. And so this has been part of my upbringing, is that we in Rhodesia had this white man's burden, this idea that we're responsible to help and to care for the black people around us. And so in that sense, I suppose I'd be called a racist, because I treat black people much better than I treat a white person. In fact, I'd never be as rude to a black person as I can be to a white person that I disagree with. So my racism has always been that, you treat them better because you don't expect as much from them. You don't expect as much standards. And I think that was part of the way we were brought up. My father was the hotel manager, and everyone who was employed there, he felt responsible to help them in whatever way they needed. As my mother felt obligated to give medical care to people who came to her without ever the thought of charging them for the vast amount of medicines and other things she dispensed from our door. So when I was converted, 1977, I came from a secular family. We didn't pray, we didn't go to church, we didn't go to Sunday school. I did hear the Bible and I did sing hymns at school, but I don't think a spiritual concept entered my heart. We were just a very secular family. Christmas was secular, Easter was secular, never went to church on Sunday. So I was brought up in a home where we would have called ourselves agnostics. Now, when I asked my parents why we didn't go to church, their response was, they lived through the Second World War. You can't believe in God because of what we saw in the Second World War. So my parents were traumatized and secularized by the brutality of World War II. bombing of cities and all of that sort of thing. So imagine my amazement when I come to South Africa from Rhodesia in a very secular environment, and I suddenly come to South Africa and I'm surrounded by Christians, and I meet Christians everywhere. And the principal, the teacher in the classroom, everywhere. Just Cape Town, 1977, was just staggeringly Christian. And for someone from a secular background, it was like right, left, and centre. Well, I went to the cinema on a Sunday. Now, in Rhodesia, we had cinemas on Sundays, like I think most countries in the world, but not South Africa. In the 1970s and 80s, cinemas were closed on Sundays. In fact, all commercial activity was closed on Sundays. It was in honour of the Lord's Day. So that was South Africa in those days. And I remember my parents grumbling over, why the government can't let us decide what to do on Sundays. And at the time, I sort of echoed that without understanding what we were going to lose when it went away. And everything got so commercialized that Sunday was like traffic jam day around shopping centres. So I went to the cinema on a Sunday, and the people were pouring in, and I liked the look of the poster that was outside of the film that was showing them. I thought, these people are dressed very well. All in suits and ties, and ladies with hats and gloves and all this, and dresses. And I got inside and I was sitting down and I was thinking, we didn't pay. And then they started to sing hymns, and I was thinking, this is very strange, but maybe this is what South Africans do on Sundays. So I'm still expecting the film, but you see the poster outside. I didn't know the local Baptist church had hired out this hall for an evangelistic rally. I wouldn't have even known what that was, actually. Right. And when a man stood up to preach, I looked around to see if I could get out, and I couldn't. I was too far forward. The lights were still on. I stuck the Pineless Stir Cinema at that time, 900-seater. And so he started talking about, if your life's been spared for any reason, it was a time when it looked like you were going to die and you survived. And I thought, yes, he said, it's for a reason. God's kept your life for a reason. And I'm thinking, my mother was brought up in Berlin. She went through multiple thousand bomber raids. She was 6 years old when had the first bombing in 1940, nearly trampled to death at a circus as the bombs fell all around, stampeding people and animals. And she went through many of these thousand bomber raids later, from age 6 to 11. She experienced a lot of the horrors. My dad spoke about being bombed in Britain by the Heinkel 111s coming over his barracks and falling on the parade ground, tilting his helmet to cover the back of his neck. He said, what goes up will come down. And he said he saw his barracks go up like matchsticks, and he saw it coming down, felt it coming down all over him. And I remember that later when I was bombed up in Sudan, exactly what my parents had explained. When you're bombed, you've got to try and, if you can, cover your ears and open your mouth. You must keep your mouth open. You could blow your eardrums from the equilibrium being, because of the pressure. You must keep your mouth open and try and cover your ears if possible. And I remembered that just from my parents talking when small. My parents mentioned how I was very sickly as a child, and there were several times I was concerned about my survival, and all this going through my mind while I'm sitting in the cinema, and as he's talking about, it was a time when you could have died. And my mother said she was taking thalidomide tablets in 1959. I was born 1960, January. And thalidomide tablets were meant to stop nausea.
That's right. Yeah, and that
the children
affected
of those
children.
born with thalidomide, they were born without arms, legs, horribly deformed. And so there was a great panic at that time. And anyone who's taking thalidomide was advised to, not just permitted, but advised to get an abortion. And so my mother, in Pinellas at the St. Joseph's Hospital, what now is Vincent Bulawayo Hospital, was advised you must have an abortion because you were taking thalidomide. And my mother could not bring herself to do it. As a nurse, she knew what an abortion was, and my mother was always very against abortion.
Right.
So she called for a chaplain and asked for prayer. And although we were not a practicing Christian family, my mother went ahead and got my hands and arms and everything else. Now, I'd heard that, and yet I'd never thanked God, not once, for any of this. And how I was sick on Pendennis Castle, traveling past Madeira, and I had a contagious disease. They wanted to put me off the ship on an island, and my mother called for a minister on the boat to come and pray for me again, and I was healed. And there were different stories like this. As a young adventurous boy in Rhodesia, I tried to walk across a waterfall, got washed overboard, and my mother saying, I don't know how you survived. You must have had 9 lives like a cat and an angel protecting you. So for some reason, at this moment, it's all coming to my mind. I'm thinking, I never so much as thanked God for any of this. And suddenly all of my disbelief had just vanished. And as the minister spoke about what Jesus Christ had suffered and done for me, what he had suffered on the cross for me, and he said, what have you ever done for Christ? And I sat there dumbfounded, and I was racking my brains, and I had to say, nothing. I've never done anything for God. In fact, I've been quite selfish. I was a very introverted, quiet, animals, books, mind my own business. When my children have asked, what friends did you have at school? Well, I could mention different animals, but I never had any human friends. I had furry friends. But I was a very quiet, selfish person. I don't think I'd done anything for anyone. And I first of all felt convicted of ingratitude and in selfishness. And when they called for people to make commitment, I went forward. I mean, this is the first time I've heard the gospel in my recollection. I walked forward, I knelt at the front, and I knew, and this, we're talking about 43 years ago, I knew that 3rd of April 1977 that I was not just converted, but called to missions. Now, I'd never met a missionary, I'd never heard of a missionary. Later I discovered I actually did know of a missionary, David Livingston, but I never knew he was a missionary at the time. I just knew him as an explorer. Right. But I was convinced, I walked out of that cinema in 1977, convinced I'm called to missions for the rest of my life. And not that I had a clue what that meant yet, but I knew that I had to dedicate the rest of my life to spreading the gospel. I'd been so ignorant, selfish, thankless, ungrateful, and now my whole life was going to change. And I told my parents back home, of course they were ridiculing this, and yet from that point, within a month, I was involved in a holiday mission with Scripture Union, and then I was teaching in the youth group, and I was doing literature evangelism, and before the end of the year I was teaching a Sunday school and running the youth group, and then I got the first mission I heard of that came past our mission, past the church, was Hospital Christian Fellowship's founder, Francis Grimm, a legendary man, a man who had planted Hospital Christian Fellowships in 100 countries of the world. Right. The first missionary I heard, the first mission I saw, I ran to the front at the end, and I volunteered to join a mission, and I threw my bursaries, my chances at scholarships out the window at both Stellenbosch and the University of Cape Town, and I was off to live by faith, working with Hospital Christian Fellowship. My parents were furious, and there I was hitchhiking around the country doing some crazy things. And then my military call-up came, and as I went into the South African Army, I didn't realize, but this was where my calling was going to crystallize, because obviously you were conscripted. I was too young for the Rhodesian War, but this is now 1979, July 1979. I'm now heading into the South African Army, and I was told, make your stand for Christ early. So my first meal in the army, I thought, well, the best way to make a clear stand for Christ is to give thanks for my food properly, because then any other Christian will see. So I didn't just scratch the back of my head. I really bowed my head and closed my eyes and prayed over the food. When I lifted up my eyes, everyone around the table was laughing. Now, so why? My meat was gone. And that's when, and I never got it back. So that's when I realized what the Lord means by watch and pray. Dig the fork and protect it. Because these other chaps in the army, they would take anything that they could. Yeah. And at the first chaplain's period, I asked the chaplain after the message if I could speak, and I was terrified. I remember my heart beating out of my chest, and my throat was so dry, and I felt terrified, because it was probably one of the most terrifying things as an introverted, quiet person that I was at the time. I had to turn around. I faced 500 men, maybe it was more, in our company. They'd be whittled down to 120 very soon by selection, but at that stage, that first Sunday, we were a good 500 in the hall. And I stood up and I said, I love the Lord Jesus Christ with all my heart, and I want to honor him during my next 2 years here. If anyone else feels the same, please see me afterwards. Let's start a Bible study and a prayer fellowship. And that's where our mission began. Wow. There were 3 of us to start with. We met every night for Bible study and prayer. we sometimes had prayer meetings on late Saturday night. Sometimes we had all-night prayer meetings through the night and Saturday nights. Sometimes we organized big outreaches. Tremendous things happened. Miracles happened. Lives got transformed. But out of the 2 years in the South African Infantry grew not just a powerful mission, a powerful prayer fellowship, and many people came to the Lord in our time in the army, and even people on the other side that we captured. But the vision for Frontline Fellowship came out. So I came out of the army with a very clear picture that I was to get a motorbike, get a projector, get the Jesus film, Bibles, and start to smuggle Bibles across the border to communist Mozambique and to communist Angola and then to Zimbabwe. And that's what I did. And so for the last 38 years, since Easter 1982, I've been ministering all over Africa. In fact, I worked it out the other day. I've traveled in 42 countries of the world, and I've ministered in 38 countries of the world. And in Africa, all the way up to Nigeria and Sudan, Congo, and everything south of that. So it's been an extraordinary challenge and a real adventure. And during that time, I've been bombed, I've been ambushed, I've been imprisoned, I've been waterboarded and interrogated and solitary confinement and all of that. So yes, I know Africa. I know Africa on the ground, and I know Africa behind the lines, and I understand Africa's history, recent history, I think better than the ones who are running around trying to give us all kinds of politically correct liberal propaganda.
Tell us about your imprisonment in Zambia. What happened there?
1987, October 1987, I was leading a team. There were 4 of us in total. Interesting enough, it's the only time in our missions history in 38 years that everyone on the team had a British passport. Although I was not born in Britain, my father was, and my father, being a British soldier, had earned me the right to have British citizenship. So I've travelled with British passport all of my life, even though I'm a South African citizen too, of course. But we were all British passport holders, which is quite extraordinary. One of the chaps was an ex-Rhodesian Special Air Service chap, had also been in the Australian Special Forces Commandos and the British Parabats before as well, and South African Recce's. But there was 4 of us, and we were driving across Botswana, crossing at Kazungula Ferry, across Zambia. Now, we weren't going to work in Zambia, we were just crossing Zambia to get to Malawi. And from Malawi, we were going to deploy into Mozambique, help the resistance movement, Renamo, do a lot of evangelistic work. We had a lot of Bibles, books, materials, and so on. Right. We had, of course, a lot of camping equipment because we were going to foot it, as we'd say in Mozambique. Well, we didn't get anywhere. From the moment we crossed Kazungula Ferry into Zambia, we were grabbed immediately, and they started searching everything, ransacking everything. They were super suspicious. They were very hyper. And apparently, Kahunda had put out some major speech just the day before on beware of South African white terrorists, invaders, spies, whatever. And so they were at heightened alertness, and we just, 4 white young men coming from South Africa, didn't have their British passports, so they just arrested us and threw us into Livingston prison. And it was a day of all kinds of trauma, and we had bad cop, good cop. Everything's okay, it's not a problem, been a misunderstanding, just wait a bit here and so on, and everything. Then in comes the bad cop, and get stripped of everything. And then so we had this up and down, you're about to be released, and we're about to shoot you and all that sort of thing. So we went through a night of trauma in Livingston prison, and police jail, and in my cell we were stripped. We were lying in filth, in filthy cells, where the walls were covered in human excrement, the floors. No. We talked about cockroaches, spiders, every kind. Just to give you the indication of how we were singing in there and all the rest. But I counted at the end of that first night 65 spider bites and mosquito bites on 1 foot, just 1 foot.
Wow.
I didn't want to count the rest of my body because the whole body was a relief map of angry red sores. And the next morning, can you believe it, I came out of the cell in Livingston into a police interrogation room, And on the table, I saw almost everything I'd written to that date. It's 1987, still quite a bit, on the table. Now, we didn't travel with this material across the border. How did they get that? And there were people that looked like they might have traveled from far, some people like in a suit, and there was military people in there in their camouflage holding AK-47s with bayonets attached. And it was pretty hairy. And so they started to ask, what do you think about Nelson Mandela? And I said, he's a communist terrorist. And what do you think about Kenneth Kaunda? I said, am I here for something I think, or have I broken the law in Zambia? Shut up and answer the question. And, well, there's policy socialist humanism. Well, what do you think about that? Well, I'm a Christian. Well, so is Kenneth Kaunda. So? Well, what do you think of his policies? Well, I don't support socialism. And yes, well, you've said here this, that, and the other, and so on. I said, well, if you know what I've written, why are you asking me? And rifle butt in the head. And, well, after this kind of nonsense, suddenly they hooded me. Some sack tightened around the neck, chained behind the back, shackles on the ankles, and I was shuffled out there. And apparently they must have done something like this to the other three who were part of my team. Of course, we couldn't talk to one another. And if I tried to talk, ask something, just wham, they shut us up quickly. Well, we were shuffled outside into the courtyard, and I could feel the surface, and then we were put in the back of a truck, Bedford truck, and then we started to drive away. And very soon I could feel we were going on dirt road. And I must say, the thing that's coming into my mind is they're going to shoot us in the head and dump us in the ground somewhere out here in the bush. Yeah. But then we felt the actual, you could feel, now we're driving on tarmac. I mean, gudunk every now and then. This is an airstrip. There's no road in Zambia that's this smooth. And next thing, we've been taken up some plainly metal stairs. I thought we've been put into aircraft, and sure enough, we were put into aircraft. I could feel the sides of the doors I went through, and you've got to duck your head because it was quite a small aircraft. And it was put in, and it was actually quite a comfortable seat too. And I must have tried to move my blind that I could see a bit, and there must have been soldiers facing us, because every time I tried to move, I'd be smacked in the head with a rifle butt. Try to ask something, smacked again. Try to ask who's next to me again. So they wouldn't let us talk, communicate, nothing. I had to keep quiet. Now, to be honest, my biggest fear started to come into play, I thought, because I knew I'd done nothing against Zambia, written very little on Zambia. My focus was Mozambique and Angola. My biggest fear right now was we were going to be flown to Mozambique or Angola, where I would be in deep trouble, because we had smuggled a lot of things in there. I'd been working with the UNITA freedom fighters in Angola, Renamo in Mozambique. I'd written a lot exposing the atrocities of Frelimo communist dictatorship of Simão Michel in Mozambique, and a lot about Agostinho Neto and later Chissano's horrible regime in Angola. So Dos Santos. So I was, my biggest fear was we were going to be flown to either Luanda or Maputo. Right. Or even Harare, which also wouldn't be good. So that's what I'm thinking. Well, actually, Rob, the Aussie amongst our team, the ex-SS chap from Rhodesia Sea Squadron, he said he was thinking they're going to take us up and open the door and push us out.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Without parachute. And the one Britisher that we had with us was thinking, oh, good, they're going to fly us home. So it just shows the ignorance of this. Well, we flew maybe an hour. It seemed longer. And when we landed, I must admit, I thought we could have been flying 2 hours, and that we might be in Lusaka, in Harare or in Maputo. But as it happens, as we came out, they took the hoods off, and I saw Lusaka Central Airport, and I felt relieved. I felt absolutely relieved, because I still thought I've done nothing against Zambia. I've never broken any of their laws. What are they going to worry about here? I didn't understand the paranoia of the Kaunda government, and that actually we were in a very bad situation. They then paraded us through the streets of Lusaka. Wow. And we were barefoot. And this brought back to my mind, when I was a boy, 14 years old in Rhodesia, 1974, I remember seeing a picture in the newspaper of Ian Sutherland. He is a Rhodesian special operative who had been captured in Zambia, and there he was, bearded, shackled, chained, and he was being led barefoot through the streets of Lusaka, being prodded by rifle butts and smacked by rifle butts and prodded by bayonets as he went through the streets of being paraded. I remember looking at that and saying to my parents, how could he let himself be captured? I'd never let myself be captured. And I must say, at that stage of my life, after being a soldier and being a missionary and working behind enemy lines, I'd come to terms with the fact that I could die, could get crippled even. I prefer not to be crippled, but I could handle it. But the biggest fear I had in my life was being captured and at the mercy of communists who I knew had no moral standards holding them back from serious atrocities. Plus, at that stage, I'd read Amnesty International and International Society for Human Rights reports. So ignorance is bliss, and I was not ignorant. Unfortunately, I knew too much about the kinds of tortures and the mistreatment that could come in these places. So at that point, being led through the streets of Lusaka, I started to sing. This is the day the Lord has made, a mighty fortress our garden. They tried to smack us with rifle butts at first, but we just sang louder. And of course, now people are watching them. So after a while, the soldiers pulled back, and actually later on, one of the soldiers said to us, I'm sorry, which is interesting. And you know, as the hoods were taken off our heads, the big sacks, the first thing I noticed on our handcuffs was made in Great Britain. And for some reason, I found it hilarious. And although I hadn't drunk a thing in 25 hours, I just laughed and choked because it just seemed hysterically funny.
Yeah.
There we were, 4 British missionaries with made in Great Britain handcuffs. Well, all around we saw the weapons were British and things like this too. And we were taken to police headquarters in downtown Lusaka and got our first bits of interrogation, then off to Lusaka Central Prison. And the sun was setting. It had been a very long day. We'd been arrested the previous morning, spent the first night in Livingston, now we're in Lusaka. The sun started set. We go through these big gates into a small courtyard, and then they took us to a little gate under a guard tower into a massive quadrangle, actually more like a pentagon-sized, 5-shaped sized area, courtyard in Lusaka Central Prison. And as we were taken through there, the whole place was deserted because even before the sun sets, they put all the prisoners in their cells.
Right.
And I went and opened cell 11 door. And I found out later cell 11 was the international detainees, that's presidential detainees on order of the president, so without charge, detained. And we were being pushed in, just 3 of us, into this one cell, which was crowded. And as we went through, the guard behind said, these are white terrorists responsible for the deaths of millions. Shut the door behind us. Pitched on. Now,
wow.
Basically what they'd said is, do what you want.
Go
we
for
don't care.
Yeah.
Basically. So you can imagine, at that moment, I introduced myself as a missionary from South Africa, and I greeted in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and I started to proclaim the gospel and explain what we were there for. And immediately we were welcomed with warmth. Actually, these people in the cell, they all knew what brutal savages were the people over us because they had all been tortured. And the stories we found from the people, there was a major who had studied in Sandhurst who was thrown in there because he said in a private conversation, sanctions will hurt Zambia more than South Africa. And for that disloyal comment, he got thrown in. There was a Muslim trader from literally Timbuktu, from Mali. And he had just been arrested and thrown there because they confiscated all his goods. Much easier than buying them, I suppose. And then there was a Hindu man, an old Indian man, he's well in his 60s, and he had owned a mine years ago, and Kahunda had nationalized it and threw him in prison. Cheaper than buying it, I suppose. There were all sorts of people, and had all sorts of stories, and one of the people there was a South African truck driver, Isaiah Moyo. I actually later learned that he was ex-Rhodesian African Rifles, and he had worked with 5 Reconnaissance Commando, but at that stage, all we knew of him was he was a truck driver from Soweto, and he had lent money to ANC exiles, cadres, in Lusaka, and instead of paying their bills, their debts, they decided to call him a spy, and so he got thrown in there. Now, as it so happens, he was doing a scouting operation for the reconnaissance commander, but they wouldn't have known that. He just got thrown in because he had lent money hoping to build up a relationship, and they just found the best way to avoid paying debts is to call a person a spy. Anyway, Isaiah later became a friend. He had 2 children and a wife waiting back in Soweto, actually Palabora. He is a sergeant in Old Rhodesian African Rifles and 5 reconnaissance commander, but that we only learned later. Well, he became one of our best friends in there. And in this little cell, our cells were 15 feet by 25 feet. 15
How
feet
many
by
people
25
are in
feet.
it?
An average of 60 to 65 prisoners in a cell. Now,
In that
for you to
small
imagine-
space?
Yes, so there's no bunks, there's no furniture, there's no plumbing, there's no electricity. In a small place with a very low ceiling, very low corrugated iron ceiling, you can imagine how stiflingly hot it was.
Yeah.
There was only about a 1 foot square opening at the door with some bars in it. So that was the only opening for air. There was no air vents, there was no windows aside from in the door itself where the guards could look in. So we'd have to all lie on our sides. You couldn't lie on your back. There wasn't enough space for that.
But where did
You
you
lay like so.
where'd you go to the toilet?
Well, there was a bucket in the corner, and everything had to be brought in buckets or taken out in buckets, because when the British built the prison, they built the prison for 80 people. 80. There was 1,200 in there when we were locked up. Now,
Wow.
when the British built it, there was plumbing, there was electricity. For example, Kenneth Kaunda was once locked up and had a cell to himself with bed and sheets and pillow and with gramophone and books and a desk and with sofa, and he had hot food brought in, and he had lights, and he had access to the library. So the evil, demonic colonial British, they imprisoned them with electricity and plumbing and hygiene and 3 cooked meals a day. When we were there was 1 meal a day, and that was in the middle in a big cooking pot, these big iron pots where it was just starch, a stava pup, sadza. That was it, just stiff porridge. The only protein was the flies, of which there was a fair bit in it, and there was no plates. We had no eating utensils, no plates. They would dish up into your hands, and you'd have to eat it sort of like a dog. That was the only meal provided a day. The only water, there's no running water in the whole prison. That went with the colonials. You'd have to carry in water in buckets, and you'd have to carry out filth in other buckets. And so that was the situation. So you're talking about a stinking disease factory.
Oh.
Now, our shoes have been taken away from us already in Livingston. So we're barefoot. We're scruffy. We hadn't been able to wash or clean, and of course everything's taken away. I didn't have Bibles, we didn't have a toiletry kit, we didn't have toothbrush, nothing. Didn't have a book, which for me is trauma. But being something of a real hygiene person, I like my clean pillowcases and clean water and hot showers in the morning and so on. Walking barefoot on a place where everyone spits and urinates and defecates, and it's just one big stinking disease factory. Walking with bleeding feet, where there's, broken glass and all sorts of sharp stones and so on too, and thorns. So you can imagine, at that moment, the height of the AIDS fear and pandemic fears, I was thinking, I'm going to die of AIDS in here. And that was one of the worst thoughts that you could have back in 1987, AIDS. So it was not a good situation. And but we made friends pretty quickly. And during the day, when the people realized we were missionaries, every day the people coming to us for counseling and for prayer. And so I knew I needed physical fitness, so I'd say, walk with me. And we'd walk backwards and forwards across the courtyard. And I think I made many kilometers a day just walking back and forwards, talking with people, counseling them.
Yeah.
We were doing exercises and so on. And the next thing, the guards would come and drag one or the other of us off. Most of our team only got taken for interrogation once, but they very quickly identified me as the leader. And so I went for 6 interrogations. And each interrogation was 5 to 6 hours, sometimes 7. And it involved, if I said waterboarding, that would be nice. Yes, waterboarding suggests clean water. That would have been pleasant to have just had drowning experience in clean water, but they used urine and filth and buckets of
no.
Yeah, I'm talking about so so that you'd ingest and pass out in filth, and of course, no opportunity to clean yourself off afterwards. So, in fact, the special branch chap who was interrogating me first off, he said, "We can't do to you what we do to our people, because you've got a British passport. We'll have to let you go one of these days, and so I can't break any bones or pull out any teeth or fingernails or things like that, which we do with our own people. But I know what you whites hate. You hate dirt and disease." And so that's what they worked on. They worked on what they could see was going to
just
unsettle us. Yeah, well, so you can imagine my biggest concern was disease.
Yeah.
We really had to pray a lot each day about that. So at every opportunity I was preaching and teaching, when I went for interrogation, I'd ask them for my Bible. I could see my Bible sitting there in the corner of this office of the special branch guy. And so the special branch officer pulled out of his pocket a little red book, and he says, "This is my Bible. You can have this," which was in English, Mao's little red book, Mao's thoughts. Paid through a bit, and I said, "But you know, Mao didn't walk on water. He didn't die for your sins. He didn't rise from dead, and he can't take you to heaven." And this man swore a whole lot of things at me, as you'd expect. Gave him back his Bible. I went in for a bit more torment from these characters. And next to me in the prison cell was Isaiah Moyo. Isaiah Moyo, being black, they tortured him like they wanted to. So he had red-hot pokers heated in the fire, pushed against his body. So his body was full of pussy sores. He had 18, 20 or more pussy sores in his body, and they would swell up and then they'd burst. You can imagine the pain he was in. His knees were calloused from, he was so often on his knees just praying. And in the prison, interestingly enough, we made a lot of friends. In fact, I on several occasions had church services in all the prison. I mean, all 1,200 would gather around and I'd preach to them. And they just loved it. And of course, I didn't have notes, I didn't have a Bible, I didn't have a PA system. But you adapt in a situation like this, and a lot of things come back to your memory that you might not have thought that you could remember, times like that. And we had Bible studies at night, discussions, debates. In fact, I had such an educated bunch in my cell, because they were some of the cream of Zambia in many ways, top military and economic and other leaders and traders. And so we had very interesting discussions. And do you know that this is the sort of thing that can only really happen in Africa? I didn't realize, but in that prison, I was building up relationships with the next government of Zambia, because in Africa, yesterday's prisoner can be tomorrow's president. Right. And Frederick Chiluba, now I didn't personally meet Frederick Chiluba, but he was in that prison apparently at the same time. But I did meet Godfrey Miyanda. Now, Godfrey Miyanda became deputy president, minister of education, and in fact, Godfrey Miyanda was in many ways the elder brother who was a counselor and advisor to Frederick Chiluba and guided him on this declaring Zambia a Christian state when they managed to overthrow Kaunda in 1991. So interesting that I didn't realize that I was going to go from prohibited immigrant, presidential detainee to VIP and friend of the next government. That's the way things go in Africa. But regularly when I stood up to preach, the little door would open, out would come a bunch of these guards, and they'd grab me and they'd drag me away, and I'd go to another interrogation. And so I seldom managed to finish a sermon in the open area, because someone in the guard tower must have said this white missionary is getting too many friends down here. But everyone in a prison started to look out for us, help us, protect us, care for us. Interesting, I don't think we had one hostile person on the ground inside the prison. All our hostility was outside. And it's something when I thought that prisons are where all the bad people are. But in Zambia, in 1987, it seemed to me that the nice people were in the prison, the horrible people were the ones outside running it.
Right.
That tells you a lot about a country.
Yeah. Now, how long were you in prison for?
16 days on that occasion. So, well, I must say, when you don't know if you're going to be there for a month, a year, or the rest of your life, a day is a long time in that situation. So, 16 days, and it was over a week before we actually had some food brought into us in brown paper packets from the British Embassy. the British had heard about us being in there. In fact, it was from a black chaplain who came to prison, Bonali Ferry, and he was shocked when he saw these white missionaries in there, and we identified ourselves as missionaries. He got out and he sounded the whistle, actually, and informed the British Embassy, and all sorts of things started to move. Now, interestingly, we had good friends overseas who, very good friends like Father Arthur Lewis, who had started the Rhodesia Christian Group, and Dennis Walker, who was a member of Parliament, in fact, a member of the cabinet in Rhodesia, and they were now living in Britain. So they got word about us being imprisoned, and thanks to Bonali Ferry to a large extent, who's a friend to this day. But it was Dennis Walker who managed to ensure that the British Prime Minister at that time, Margaret Thatcher, received our information. So timing-wise, it's October 1987. Margaret Thatcher was on her way to Vancouver, Canada, for the Commonwealth Conference, 1987, October 87. How's that for timing? And at that conference, the number one character who was going to be attacking Margaret Thatcher was Kenneth Kaunda, our president, who detainees we were. So he's the chairman of the Frontline States. And at that moment, 1987, the biggest issue was trying to force Britain to put sanctions, economic sanctions, on South Africa. Right. And Margaret Thatcher was refusing. So Kenneth Kaunda stands up there, but Margaret Thatcher's been given all of our details ahead of time.
Right.
She's a clever card player, I'm sure. So Kenneth Kaunda stands up and he bellows, "Why aren't you putting sanctions on South Africa?" Margaret Thatcher responds, "Well, why don't you put sanctions on South Africa yourself?" He said, "That would put Zambians out of work." She said, "Exactly." And she started to list off how many hundreds of thousands of Zambians were working in South Africa, migrant workers, how much money they generate for the economy, how the Zambian Railways was pulled by South African locomotives, South African Railways maintained the Zambian Railways, how the South African Airways maintained the Zambian Airways and did all their services and provided pilots and so on, how the South African veterinarians provided the cattle dips, and when a Zambian was bitten by a snake bite, the serum to counteract it came from Hoedspruit outside Pretoria. And so she had all her facts down there. Well, Kenneth Kaunda then came up with, because of the human rights abuses, you should impose sanctions on South Africa. And Margaret Thatcher said, "Who are you to talk about human rights abuses? You are the unelected dictator of a one-party state. You have 4 British missionaries locked up without charge, being tortured and abused by your security forces right now in Lusaka Central Prison." And she had all of our facts there. And apparently Kenneth Kaunda was speechless, dumbstruck. I mean, the Iron Lady had knocked him for a 6. It was a knockout blow. He was out for the count, and he had nothing more he could say against Margaret Thatcher. She had, I've shortened the whole thing, but this confrontation was epic. And Margaret Thatcher walked out there triumphant, of course, and Britain continued with constructive engagement instead of going to economic sanctions. And apparently Kaunda's first words as he came out of down the ramp at Lusaka Central Prison was, "Get those missionaries out of here." And the very next morning we had a man in a suit arriving at the gate, and I was called to front, and I put up my hands to be handcuffed, because normally that's what happened before we went through the small gate, and just shook my hand and said, "The President has ordered your release." And we went back to say goodbye to our friends, and it was an extraordinary thing. On the way out, he took us past the Freedom Monument, and I couldn't help but notice the Freedom Monument is behind bars in Lusaka. It's a famous monument there. Well, it wasn't too late after that Kenneth Kaunda was asking for us to come back to Zambia to apologize publicly for how badly we were treated. And I said, "I know how this works. Kenneth Kaunda is unpopular. He's getting a lot of pressure. A lot of people want to get rid of him, and he wants to use us for a publicity stunt." I said, "Well, you want to use me, I want to use you." I'm talking through his lawyer now in South Africa. I said, "If I come back to Zambia to appear on this TV program that you want, I must be allowed access to the prison. I want to go to the prison. I can't go to the prison empty-handed. I must be allowed to take gifts. I want to take soap and salt and books and pens and toothbrushes and the things that other people are wanting. And so I must be allowed to talk to people and deliver these things in person." And so there was delays and delays and delays, but finally they allowed us to go. And all sorts of great things happened. I was, in fact, shortly after that, in 1988, I was going around Britain and Germany, and I got to International Society of Human Rights Convention in Frankfurt, and also spoke on the BBC World Service. And I put Isaiah Moya's case, this Soweto truck driver tortured in Lusaka Central. And so I got the story later from Isaiah, met him up in Palabora, and when I was speaking around military base, because I never knew he was actually a fellow South African soldier, ex-Rhodesian at that. But Isaiah says that the guards came running with a shortwave radio into the cell, said, Isaiah, that white missionary is here. He's talking on the radio. He's talking about you. And Isaiah heard the last part of me on the BBC World Service speaking about Isaiah Moya and giving the postal address. Isaiah said they dragged mail sacks of parcels and letters to him, people sending him soap and salt and all sorts of great things. And he said he became the most popular person in the prison. He had never tortured or mistreated again. He became a celebrity. And within a month of me broadcasting on BBC, now we're talking about February 1988, he was free and back to his family. So I learned a lot out of that, God can open prison doors and set the captives free, and we've got the power to release and to bind. And a lot of people are in prison today because we're not speaking up. And publicity provides protection for the persecuted. And so we've got to use every means we've got. Radio programs like this, podcasts, social media. If we speak up for those who are suffering, we can save lives and we can set captives free. So I'm convinced we must use everything we can to speak up for those targeted by evil. Because when you shine the light, you know what happens. The cockroaches run for the darkness.
Yeah.
They don't like the light.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, we talked about genocide earlier in this live stream, and one of the basic parameters of a genocide is when the government and their bodies, like the police service and the judiciary, start targeting a particular group of people. And one of the classic cases I always refer to is what happened to Vicky Momberg, that woman who was mugged, and she was absolutely in an emotional turmoil, and she used the K word a few times, and then she was thrown into prison for 2 years. That's a sentence she was given. And when you look at what the politicians are saying and doing in South Africa, and they're just given a pass, it just clearly demonstrates that the judiciary and the South African police service as well are part of this persecution of the minority groups. And I'm not just saying the white population, certainly the Indian population. There are a number of groups in South Africa who've been persecuted, which is quite awful. Now, I want to move on to today, because you're the founder and director of Frontline Fellowship. I mean, you have an amazing story, and I'd love to have you on again to talk more about other things. But, you know, I was watching that video about what you've done in the Nuba Mountains in Sudan. Quite extraordinary under the circumstances. Absolutely amazing. And I just want to tell everybody who's watching this video now and who will watch it later that in the description below, you'll see there's a link to a PDF, which is your latest Frontline Fellowship brochure that you sent, which is a 16-pager. And anyone who downloads that document will get an idea of how amazing the man is that I'm talking to tonight. And I just want to talk to you about how that particular outreach started. I mean, what drove you to actually start that?
Well, that's actually quite extraordinary, because at every stage of our work, it's so clear how we led to Mozambique in 82 and to Angola in 85. And in 1994, you'll recall, well, to back up a bit, 1988, absolutely the high point of the Cold War and military confrontations in Angola, and it was a conventional warfare, and the South African 61 Mechanized Battalion Group absolutely wiped out the Cuban Mechanized divisions that we find them the elite of the Cuba, the Presidential Guard, Mechanized division of Castro. And the highlight of this massive war in Angola was the complete defeat of the Cuban and communist forces, the Soviet weapons in Angola. And as the war in Southwest Africa came to an end, the Berlin Wall fell in 89. And that was extraordinary. I was also involved in Bible smuggling behind the Iron Curtain too, which is a whole other story. But the Berlin Wall coming down was a culmination of decades of phenomenal work. And later on, it came out that Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, and P.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan were playing a very strong war, helping put freedom on the offensive and to bring down the Soviet satellites by supporting the resistance movements like Renamo in Mozambique and UNITA in Angola and the Contras in Nicaragua and Mujahideen in Afghanistan and the Solidarity in Poland. And so all over the communist world, the communist empire was crackling. And since then, Russian veterans of Angola have written books like Angola, the beginning of the end of the Soviet empire. And so Russians looked and said, we thought we couldn't win a nuclear war with NATO, but we thought we could at least win a conventional war with the West. But when we couldn't even beat the South Africans, who were sanctioned in Angola with our best conventional forces on the ground, and the morale in the Soviet army was shaken, and they said the beginning of the end started. So interesting that we had a part in that big global setup. And when the Berlin Wall came down and the Cuban troops started to withdraw from Angola, a whole set of things were set in motion. And that led to the first elections in Mozambique, Angola, Zambia, toppling of Kaunda, changes, free enterprise allowed in Mozambique, churches allowed to be opened again. All sorts of things happened. And of course, Southwest Africa, Namibia, South Africa elections. So in 1994, suddenly all the wars in Southern Africa stopped. Now, we were a mission to the war zones. Frontline Fellowship right from the beginning as a mission of people from military background, grew out of our prayer fellowship in the South African Infantry. And we'd been working in all these war zones, Mozambique, Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Southwest Africa, Namibia. And suddenly all the wars in the space of a couple of years were over. And so in 1994, I was open to where will God lead us next? Because other missions are now going into the now open, free areas that had been closed in war zones before.
Right.
And the Holocaust erupted in Angola, in Rwanda. So I went up to Rwanda, and I took in a few hundred Bibles into the prisons there for the Interahamwe, and I got the first-hand testimonies. I did research. I walked knee-deep in corpses in churches, and I wrote the Holocaust in Rwanda book to document that atrocity. Now, I'd been hearing stories about Sudan, and I'd even had some correspondence from some Christians in Sudan saying, come to Sudan, we need you. Well, it was close enough. Rwanda, it's not that much further. So I hitchhiked into Sudan. I had no vehicle, no one else. I was the only person on the team. I got into Sudan, and I met a man who'd been corresponding with me, Kenneth Baringwa. And he took me by the shoulders and he said, you must come to Moraland, Equatoria, South Sudan. Now, he'd been corresponding with me because he'd heard about my work amongst Renamo, UNITA, freedom fighters in Mozambique and Angola. And he wanted me to come and help the SPLA in Sudan, fighting for the freedom of South Sudan.
Right.
Well, I was interested. And what I saw on that first mission there in 1995 in Sudan so gripped me that I came back and I did everything we could, and we drove vehicle over land and went into Sudan, and soon we were going to a place that you couldn't reach by road, and we had to fly in and having charter aircraft. And very soon, 96 already, we were going up the Nuba Mountains. And so between 1995 and 2001, I did 27 missions into Sudan, anything from 3 weeks to 5 weeks at a time. And I did about 1,200 meeting services, chaplain service and so on in South Sudan and Nuba Mountains. I walked from one end of the Nuba Mountains to the other, helping the resistance fighters, training their chaplains, training the medics, bringing in medical packs and landmine removing equipment, metal detectors, things like this, to help them find these tools of terror. And of course, writing about, produced books like Faith Under Fire in Sudan, which is one of my biggest productions ever, which helped produce films. This is the third edition, 3 times size the first one.
Where can people buy those books, Peter?
Oh, well,
is that on your website?
That's correct, frontlinemissionsa.org.
Okay.
You won't find them in the average bookshop because we are not politically correct, obviously, so you're not going to get the big suppliers pushing those. But frontlinemissionsa.org will get you to them, and as we worked with the people there, I just saw the needs, and then I saw the biggest need was behind enemy lines in the Nuba Mountains, this little island of Christianity and the Sea of Islam. And it was incredible. We were at night just seeing the traces and the parachute flares coming down and the crump of mortars. And we were way behind enemy lines and shoot on sight territory, no fly zone, you fly, you die. And so I smuggled in hundreds of thousands of Bibles and Christian books and vast amounts of supplies that would help the medics, the chaplains. We basically got the medical corps and the chaplains corps, the SPLA up and running. And so it's quite a story. And yes, there's that short 13-minute video that was just produced end of last year on the missions to the Nuba Mountains of Sudan, which gives a person a very well-edited, professional film-type look at some of what's been achieved there. But to me, it was the fact that the wars in Southern Africa had ended, but the wars were intensifying in North and Central Africa, and we basically relocated our missions. Primary focus over the last 25 years has actually been Sudan. That's been our biggest field. We've also worked in the Congo and Namibia and up in Nigeria. And we haven't neglected Zimbabwe. We've been busy in Zimbabwe every year too, since 1982, and continue to work there. Although that work you can't say much about because it's very hostile. But in Sudan, we're working with the resistance movement in the Free Nuba areas behind enemy lines.
Okay. So your organization operates in a number of countries in Africa now, doesn't it?
Yes, we do. Frontline's now been going over 38 years behind enemy lines, and we have as our biggest priority to evangelize in war zones, to assist persecuted churches and persecuted Christians, to work in these areas in order to help those who are suffering. And we are having a vision to be able to see countries like South Sudan becoming independent and free. That was something we worked at long and hard. In fact, I remember arguing with the leaders of the people of South Sudan, Colonel John Garang, the head of the SPLA, and Commander Salva Kiir, who today is the president of South Sudan. As recently as 2001, they were arguing with me, it's not possible for South Sudan to be independent. And I said, it's the only way. You can't just fight for autonomy, you've got to fight for independence. Because unless you redraw the map, black Christians in the south of Sudan will always be a minority to the Muslim Arab north, and you will be persecuted. Unless you can redraw the map where you're the majority in your own area. And so I argued secession, and I've witnessed secessions, successful secessions in Croatia and Slovenia, in what used to be Yugoslavia, and Slovakia, of what used to be Czechoslovakia, and Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and what used to be part of the Soviet Union. And I believe secession, independence, decentralization is one of the solutions to a lot of the mindless wars that have gone on throughout the world. And that's another reason why I support independence for the Western Cape, Cape of Good Hope. And
now that's something.
Which is another story.
That's something which is, it's like God is working here, because Fiona Timms wrote, Dr. Peter appears to be strong enough to move mountains. Perhaps he can persuade all the conflicting groups to join together. And several of those groups are involved in seeking secession in the Western Cape. This is off the topic of your organization now, but seeing that we're talking about this, do you see there's a chance, if the ANC government totally collapses in South Africa, based on your past experience with secession in other countries, do you see there's a chance for the minority groups, and I'm talking about largely the coloured and the white population in the Western Cape, to break off and set up an area that is theirs, exclusive of this communist ANC government?
Yes. Not only do I think it's possible, I think it's absolutely essential for survival. I don't think it's just a good idea. I think it's the only solution to the chaos we're seeing. In fact, most of the wars that I've witnessed throughout Africa is the result of unrealistic boundaries, which put disparate groups together under some kind of centralized government. And the wars in Africa, which have cost the lives of millions of people and caused vast amounts of destruction, would not have happened if you had wise borders which recognized that a nation is an ethno-linguistic people group of a shared faith. And that's the biblical definition, an ethno-linguistic people group of a shared faith. When Jesus gave the Great Commission, he used the word ethne, make disciples of every ethne, every nation. He's not talking about country, just a geographic accident. The Hebrews were Hebrews. Even after 400 years in Egypt, the Hebrews did not become Egyptians. We are not geographic accidents. We are the descendants of our parents.
Right.
And an ethno-linguistic people group, a nation, has to be a real ethno-linguistic people group of a shared faith, and anything else is an empire. And so South Africa today is not a nation. It's 11 nations. It has 11 different language groups, official languages. In fact, there's more if you take it unofficially. Like the United States is no longer one nation. Certainly not under God anymore, sadly. But it's many nations. And so if we would just look at the days of nationalism is rising, and you can see it because Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, you can see the breakup of Yugoslavia and so on. These big multi-ethnic, multinational groupings, empires, their day's over. When the Soviet Union broke up and 15 independent republics broke away, there was a great shout of freedom. It was a good thing. It wasn't a bad thing. The independence of Ukraine and Belarus and Latvia and Lithuania, those are good things. And so I am convinced that this is the only viable, workable solution. We either go down with the South African Titanic or we launch out in a free, independent Cape of Good Hope.
Right. Okay. Now, I happen to know, I've certainly interviewed the leaders of groups like the ULA, USAF, Boereligion, Saitlanders. A couple of them are now working quite closely together, but there are others like Saitlanders who kind of, feel that they don't need to work with others. And I'm thinking of other groups like AfriForum. What has really been missing is someone who can actually inspire them to work together. And look, yes. I would love to put an email out to these guys to reach out to you, even if it's
I would very much like to work with them. In Cape Town, I've been seeking to get disparate groups like Cape Exit,
Cape
Party.
Yeah. Well, Michelle would be able to help you there.
Bringing them together and trying to get them to cooperate, because I don't see that these groups have any reason to regard one another as competition. They work at different levels. One's a political party, another's working on the legal side, another's working on the ground form. You need people who are going to work on the different sides, and they're allies. We've got the same vision, and so we've got to work together. And as somebody who's non-political, has absolutely no political ambitions or interests whatsoever, I believe I can, from the outside, help, just as I did with the people in Sudan, because I was no threat to them. I was only there to help, but there's nothing I wanted out of it. There's nothing I was getting out of it. All I was doing was helping the people in South Sudan see what was needed. And I became, to a large extent, a publicist for them. I did the work on the ground. I motivated a lot of people, but I did more meetings for Sudan outside of Sudan than even the 1,200 meetings I had inside Sudan, inspiring and educating and building up the people. And did a lot of educational seminars and workshops there. But in America and Europe, I got on many radio programs, TV programs, spoke to people, got people like Franklin Graham involved in getting in and getting hospitals going. So I think a missionary sometimes is in a nice position to work behind the scenes and just help network and get the people working together who might sometimes have not talked with one another. But we need to work together because all of our lives are on the line. And as I'm not just a father of 4 children, I'm a grandfather now, and I've got 2 grandchildren. I'm looking forward to many other grandchildren coming in the future, and I'm thinking of their future. And there's no future in a communist, centralized ANC-run South Africa, but there's great future in a decentralized confederation where we've got free states, decentralized, based on the Swiss model, based on the Singapore model, but based on tax-free zones and tax-free cities and things going all the way down to a real municipality where the local police force is run by and answerable to the local municipality, made up of homeowners and ratepayers who are the ones who are the most invested in the community, so that you don't have outsiders being able to be reckless with what generations have built up. So yes, I'm absolutely convinced that we've got workable models. I've studied history. I've seen history in the making on the ground. I'm 60 years old now. I've been a missionary now for over 40 years. So I've got a whole lot of experience and insight, which in particular, in fact, I've written on this eyewitness to successful secessions, where I speak about the successful secessions I've seen going all the way down through to Sudan. And I do believe that the Kingdom of Zululand and the Cape of Good Hope are two very viable nations within South Africa that can and will secede soon.
Right. Now, that book you talked about was Secession. Is that on your website?
That's an article, a video, a presentation.
Okay. Where can one see that? Can you perhaps give me the link, and I'll put that into below the video that we're doing today. Now, okay. Now we're talking about all these disparate groups, although groups like Buralishion and USAF are working together. Do you know any of the leaders of any of these groups? Have you had any contact with them?
No, not of Buralishion. AfriForum, I have been invited once to one of the Kragdag, which is an event hosted by them, but I'm not aware that I've ever met any of their leaders.
Right.
I know the Freedom Front folks, I know the Cape Party people, I know the Cape Exit people, I know Hein Marks of ULA.
Yeah.
And I've spoken at the different events as well on occasion. I'm just getting to know the USAF people for the first time, in fact, this week. So there's a lot more I'd like to be put in touch with, but I'm best networked right now in the Cape, also in Zululand, and we're working hard to try and get the Cape of Good Hope idea up and running. One thing I've tried to start is a Cape Republic a forum, or Cape of Good Hope forum, where we can get the different groups to at least discuss things together, because at the very least we want a non-aggression pact, and at the best we want cooperation and working together.
Yeah, well look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send an email to each one of the leaders and ask them to contact you, and I'll actually refer them to this video at about 2 hours, because we've been going for over 2 hours now, so that they can actually watch our discussion. And as you say, you're not a politician, you're a minister, but you're someone who can bring great wisdom into this whole debate, because you've been there, done that when it comes to secession in the past, and you can give great insights. And if these people can work together, it'd be fantastic for the country, because I think with what's happening now with the lockdown is a complete and utter disaster. Now, I know you have views on this lockdown that's going on because of the coronavirus. Would you like to share those with us?
Well, this is a massive grab for globalism. This is what every globalist wants. Compulsory lockdowns, only go where we tell you can go, when we tell you can go, who you can go with, where you can go, what you can say. This is communism. I had a friend from Poland write to me just this week saying, this reminds me of the dark days of communism in Poland. In fact, in some ways it's worse. And I've had people communicating to me saying that this is exactly what we had in Romania under Ceausescu, where we were restricted. And I remember when I was smuggling into Eastern Europe, that there would be checkpoints outside every city, standard checkpoints. Show me your papers, where you're going, why you're going, what right do you have to go, and searching your vehicles for no reason. This kind of nonsense, this is exactly what the globalists want. So this, to me, is the most blatant attempt at enforcing a global New World Order. And everything that the totalitarian socialist New World Order crowd wanted. And I am horrified at how easily so many Christians and church leaders are acquiescing in this interference. Whatever happened to freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of opinion, freedom of the press? All of these freedoms are suspended, and it seems our Bill of Rights, Magna Carta, are just suspended without any due process. And I don't believe there is a parliament or Congress on the planet that has the authority to interfere with these basic freedoms. They have no right to suspend these freedoms for no reason. Any government has the right in a crisis to close borders if there's a danger, or cancel flights from a certain area if there's a danger of pandemic, to advise people to high standards of hygiene, to social distancing, but they have no right to enforce a lockdown. And if this was left to the citizens to decide, it would probably work. But when you try and force people, you start to arrest people for jogging or for walking a dog or fishing, for goodness sakes. what has this got to do with anything? You would have thought that they could use their police force and army for much better purpose than this. And abuses are terrible. In my country, South Africa, we've had more people killed by the police and army during lockdown than have died officially from the COVID-19 in South Africa. So, we want to protect your health, so we're going to kill you. That kind of thing. So we should resist this. This is wrong. And we can fight a disease without the government acting like we're under martial law.
Well, I have to say that I think this lockdown is going to destroy what is left of South Africa's economy. Because you take Edcon, that huge group, they've actually said we're closing down. That's Edgar's, I think it's CNA, it's Jet, it's a whole lot of huge stores all around the country. Something like 100,000 people are going to be unemployed as a result of Edcon closing down. Now, okay, so we're talking about the economy in total disarray when we come out of the other side of this lockdown. I had an email yesterday from someone who is pretty much, he's high up in the government. And he suggested, and this is unsubstantiated, I need to say that, but he suggested that the government cannot afford to pay the SASSA at the end of this month. They haven't got the money in the bank. And can you imagine what that's going to do? What will that do to South Africa if all these unemployed cannot be paid?
I can tell you right now, if they extend this beyond the 3 weeks, at the moment it's breaking point. There's already looting of shops, there's already riots, there's already people throwing rocks at police and army in the streets. And of course, what we hear around here is this simmering resentment all over the place. Right. So if they extend this, which I think they are going to want to, the fabric's going to collapse. One economist, official economist, I think it's a South African Economist magazine, put out that the lockdown in this country is costing about 100 billion rand a week. For every week we're in lockdown, it's 100 billion rand down the drain. We can't afford that. This country's already been looted for 26 years. Our economy was in deep trouble beforehand. We're in a negative since Ramaphosa took over 2 years. The Southern economy hasn't grown a bit. It's only shrunk. We've been in negative growth over the last 2 years. This is going to put it into catastrophic nosedive. The South African rand has moved up to 19 and 20 rand to the dollar in recent days. It's hovering somewhere around 18, 19 mark. So this is catastrophic. When I first traveled overseas to America and Britain, the rand was stronger than the British pound and the US dollar. When I was brought up in Rhodesia, a Rhodesian dollar was worth 3 American dollars. And to think that now our money is, which used to be one of the strongest currencies in the world. I mean, the South African rand used to be gold-backed. And today, it's funny money.
It's junk. Absolute junk.
Junk status officially.
Yeah. Wow. Now,
this government is committing suicide with the economy. They were doing it for a long time. But this is like a more radical economic suicide.
Yeah. Now, I've got several questions here that people have asked, and we just haven't got to them because we've been really involved in a number of very interesting topics. So I'm going to start asking Peter the questions. West says, Dr. Hammond, some churches are enthusiastically praying for a corona vaccine. What should we do if the civil government wants to force compulsory vaccination on us?
I don't believe any vaccinations are valid. I believe all vaccinations are inherently dangerous. There's important people in church history who died from vaccinations. You take the greatest theologian in American history, Jonathan Edwards. He was killed by a smallpox inoculation when he was aged 58. Inoculations are very, very, very dangerous. And in fact, there's the DNA of aborted babies in most vaccines. There's a whole lot of elements of the diseases in the vaccines. Just to give the kind of logic, the best way to protect you from disease is to give you some of it. Okay, to take the same logic, the best way to protect your youngster from pornography is to give them some pornography. Does that make any sense to anybody? No. It's a disease. You want nothing to do with it. To me, vaccinations, and just look at the people promoting them. Bill Gates, the biggest promoter of vaccinations, he wants to prevent you being able to travel unless you can prove your vaccinations. Well, I will not take these vaccinations. I remember when we went in the army and we got vaccinations, we were sick as dogs. I mean, vaccinations really compromise your health instantly. And what they were giving us then is mild compared to what they're trying to give you now. And now they're putting 8 and 16 different vaccinations in one single shot. This is absolutely dangerous, because what you've got is Big Pharma creating customers for themselves. People like Bill Gates are on record saying they want to bring the world's population down to 1 billion, preferably down to 100 million. Well, there's 7 billion people on the planet right now. How do you think they're going to bring the population down so radically? And then at the same time, he's not just promoting abortions vigorously, he's promoting vaccinations. Look at the people promoting vaccinations. The World Health Organization, run by a Marxist terrorist. Do you really trust these people? When you look at the very same people who did their best to betray Rhodesia in South Africa, and they're the ones pushing the vax and all these other things, no, I'd say under no circumstances. And I've already said to our family, if anyone comes to our gate wanting to mandatory test us or vaccinate or anything, it's like, no, under no circumstances, get lost. No. Yeah. So I think this is part of making us sicker. And I know good friends who are convinced that their health problems they've got now comes directly from vaccinations that they had. So I think that there's enough scientific evidence, if you look into the people who are doing research, to say, I don't believe this is a good idea. In fact, this is very counterproductive. But just look at who's promoting it. And then I think you've got your answer as to whether it's a good idea or not.
Okay, now, just last night, we had a live stream with 2 people, and Teresa, who's actually here in Australia, she lives in Victoria with her family, and she's right into checking things out, if I can put it that way. And she came across these patents, which you can go and look up in the official US Patent Office. And the actual company that's taken out these patents is financed by Bill Gates. And it's about including the coronavirus into vaccines. It's actually there in black and white on the patent. Now, if you want to learn more about that, just have a look at my live stream last night with COVID-19 conspiracy, and you'll see the documents and you'll see how to actually look them up. This has been happening now for about 20 years. That this has been worked on, using the coronavirus in vaccines, which I find quite extraordinary.
Now, Big Pharma and the vaccination industry is in the billions. In fact, there was a time when war weapon manufacturing was the biggest industry on earth, but I believe pharmaceuticals and so on have now eclipsed them. That's the biggest industry in the world. So one of the things that these kind of industries try to do is create more customers for themselves. Well, my understanding is that vaccinations create more customers for the sick industry. They call it healthcare, but actually healthy foods healthcare. This is sick care. But vaccinations, it doesn't make sense. God made good, healthy people. Now, for example, I know mothers who've had some of their children vaccinated and then later were convinced not to vaccinate others. And they said there's no comparison. Said the ones they vaccinated had no ends of medical problems. And the ones that didn't vaccinate haven't had any day sick.
Yeah.
Now, interesting. Here's the doctor. He says, congratulations, you got a healthy baby. Healthy in every way. Let's pump a whole lot of vaccinations into him. Why? God gives natural immunizations and all the healthy things they need. If the mother eats healthily and if the baby's fed the way God has intended, there's nothing you need to worry about. But this very iniquitous big pharma industry has brainwashed the medical fraternity. And, in many cases, you can't blame the doctors because these doctors get no training on the vaccinations. They say in a 7-year medical doctor training, they might not even get as much as a day on vaccinations. In fact, it might come down to only 4 hours of looking at vaccinations, and they don't really look at it in much detail. And so these doctors are trained to promote vaccinations without any understanding of the complications, the alternatives, and so on. So I really encourage people to look into it if they haven't already. And this is one of the ways they like to control people. I'm convinced from having seen the differences from when we vaccinated to when we didn't. And I've been astounded at the excellent health of those who have had none. And you don't need to look any further than the Amish and the Mennonites in America, where they don't do any vaccinations and they're the healthiest people around.
Right. Now, in 1984, George Orwell brought out that infamous book about Big Brother. Now,
Yes,
when we talk about vaccinations, there are two technologies which are now kind of being forced on the populations around the world, in particular places like China, where, for example, in China they got 5G, which can face recognize every single Chinese citizen. And I've heard that with 5G, if you irregularly walk across a road, that that camera can actually identify you, and a few days later you get a fine in the mail because that camera actually picked up that you were walking across the street. That's obviously tracking and tracing the movements of their own people. Now, the other side, which to me is even more concerning, is that they're talking about, with this vaccination, inserting a chip into every human being, which to me is the mark of the beast. What are your views on that?
Well, I'm convinced it's a bad idea and we should resist it. But the mark of the beast, hand, head, I think it's a lot of people have the mark without any microchip, because if you start to think in the way of the world, or you start to act in the way the world wants you to, then you have the mark. So if we look at it in the biblical sense, we don't need a physical tattoo or microchip to have the mark of the beast. But certainly there's enough warnings in the Bible. You don't get any mark that they're trying to push on you anyway, just for starters. And this is a people control movement. This is one reason why I will not have a smartphone. I'm not interested in being tracked everywhere. And the technology exists that they can actually listen into your conversations in a room, even if your cell phone is inert. You've got it switched off, but it's there. There are those agencies that have the kind of technology that they can use your cell phone not only as a tracking device, GPS effectively, to locate where you are, which is why in Red China, every citizen must have a smartphone. Chinese government requires it. And that's just another reason why I personally will not accept a cell phone. I mean, not a smartphone, but a very, very simple thing. But I believe people control is what they're after. Everyone should have read 1984. If you've read George Orwell's book and you understand about Big Brother's watching you, the biggest problem is government. And those people who think government's a solution, or one world government even solution, well, the history of the 20th century is government's the biggest problem. And especially a one world type government like the UN. I've seen the United Nations at work in the Congo, I've seen them at work in Sudan, I've seen them at work in Rwanda and in Namibia, and let me tell you, and Angola, they've always been a problem, never the solution. They've made bad situations much, 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 much worse. But it's not just the UN, governments. In the 20th century, Death by Governments and by Professor Rummel and the Black Book of Communism documents hundreds of millions of people killed by their own governments. Not enemies killing people, but civilians, citizens killed by their own governments in peacetime. That's the biggest threat. It's not crime, it's not war. The biggest threat to human life in the 20th century has been governments, especially secular, humanist, communist, socialist governments in particular, Soviet Union, Red China being the worst. But bear in mind, what was George Orwell doing during the Second World War? He was working in the Ministry of Information, the propaganda department of Great Britain. And when he wrote 1984, he was thinking of Britain, because when he wrote Animal Farm, he was make a direct satire on the Soviet Union of Stalin. But when he wrote 1984, he was thinking of Great Britain. He wasn't just thinking of China and Russia. He was thinking about Britain. And he had gotten a lot of his insight from work in the Ministry of Information in Britain during the war years. And so, honestly, if we can't see we're in a surveillance society where government is interfering in every area, the fact that if someone had told me a year ago that most of the churches in the Western world would close their doors on government order and not object, I would have thought that's impossible. And yet, where is the spirit of Martin Luther? Where are the Protestants? How is it that the bulk of churches have just acquiesced to government saying you can't meet no matter what size the church? It's just incredible that we allow a government to interfere in freedom of religion. Isn't this as basic as it comes?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I've got a few more questions that people have asked here. We've still got about 300 people watching, so we obviously have a lot of interest in this. Okay, so Rick has asked, please talk about the pending Chinese colonization of Africa. Think much needed minerals in Africa and African countries, huge indebtedness to China.
Yes, it's very disturbing. I see Chinese popping up all over the place. They're not just in Cape Town, Congo, Zimbabwe, all over the place. Mugabe, a few years ago, made Chinese a compulsory subject in the only university in Zimbabwe, in Harare. Compulsory subject, I mean, have you ever heard of such a thing? And he bulldozed down the homes of hundreds of thousands of people, of informal sellers who'd sell by the side of the roads, because the Chinese wanted them to get rid of them because they were the main competition to the Chinese shops coming in. Many of the farms, in fact, the biggest diamond mine in the world right now, the Meringue Diamond Field in Zimbabwe, basically was handed over to the Chinese in exchange for weapons and other things like that. So we've seen China moving in, taking over harbors, taking over, stripping countries like Mozambique and Malawi of their timber, beautiful hardwoods, just flattening entire forests, harvesting the fish, as in so overfishing that whole coastlines have been stripped of their fish. The Chinese have caused ecological disaster all over Africa. What I've heard from Chinese people in Africa is the 19th century was the British century. The 20th century was the American century. The 21st century will be the Chinese century. And I've also heard Chinese people say that they've got 300 million excess people that they want to settle in Africa. 300 million Chinese to settle in Africa. So, well, what about the African people? And he said, well, we don't need the people, we just need the land.
Yeah.
Now, the fact is, the bulk of African countries do not have an effective defense force. And they're ripe for recolonization. Most of the militaries in Africa are more geared towards suppressing internal dissent than protecting their borders from external enemies, which I don't think exists. And as a result, I think that if China wanted to make a big power grab in Africa, they already own a lot of the resources in Africa, which corrupt dictators have signed over to them. I don't think that's legal, but still. Everything from ivory, rhino horn, diamonds, gold, chrome, platinum, forests, you name it, fish. Africa's resources have been sold out by its so-called leaders, corrupt leaders, to China in exchange for a football stadium, an airport, and a palace for His Excellency the Dictator for life, and so on. So certainly China is really moving into Africa, but the difference is to call this colonization is not very accurate, because the Belgian, Portuguese, French, German and American and Dutch, British colonials who came to Africa built railways and schools and hospitals and law courts, and they did a lot of good for the local people, raised their literacy and their health and so on. The Chinese are just coming in to take out and extract and exploit. They're not really investing in the continent in the same way as Europe did. They're not improving the life of the people in Africa at all. In many cases, they bring in their own workers, they own everything, or they will provide you with the technology which only their people can maintain, and basically excluding the local people from the market. So China is a great threat, and there are some people in Africa who see China as the greatest threat. And I believe that Africa, stripping itself bare, rotting itself from within by this culture of entitlement and corruption, is making Africa ripe for colonization, and they will long for the golden days of the European colonialist and experience what the Chinese have and how the Chinese do it, because like the people in Tibet can tell you what it's like to be colonized by the communist Chinese.
Exactly. And when it comes to the Chinese, clearly they don't care what the government does. as long as they can get their ownership of the utilities. In fact, it's a policy. It could be the most autocratic, disgusting government in power. They don't care. They say it's not our problem. It's that country's problem. We just want the utilities. They have no moral compass.
They don't care about their own people, so you can imagine how little they care about the people in Africa.
Yeah. Okay, now, I've got another question here. Dr. Hammond, while the nation has been placed under house arrest, how should Christians respond to the obscene abuse of state power and infringements on our freedom?
Yes, well, obviously we don't want to be foolish. We don't want to put our lives and liberties at risk or give statist officials an excuse to arrest, detain, fine, and so on. So there's some restrictions that one's got to, with protest, accept. However, we do have the internet. We do have social media platforms. We do have podcasts and Facebook, and we've got different ways, whether it's WhatsApp and different ways you can communicate with other people. Let's use it and let's educate people. And the worst thing we could do during this house arrest dry run for the New World Order totalitarianism is to binge on watching government garbage and indoctrination on the Clinton News Network and the Bolshevik Broadcasting Corporation. We mustn't be getting our news from Sly Magazine, Newspeak, and Useless News and World Report. There's a lot of absolute indoctrination out there from the drones who are repeating the propaganda and involved in the coronavirus psychosis pandemic, or should we call it the plandemic, panic?
Yeah.
We need to be only investing in trusted alternative media. We need to put a certain amount of good positive input into our lives. We can't just focus on the negative and the problems, but on the solutions. We must use this time to increase our physical fitness. In our family, we're doing PT every day. We're cleaning up, sorting out, tidying out, fixing, working projects, and putting a lot of things online, communicating, audio, video, many things that we can to make use of it. And I've done many programs to try and encourage a critical analysis of what they're doing, to see the China connection and to see the agenda at work here and to be able to resist it. Also, what's very good here is that those people have had their children in government schools or independent schools that are using government curriculums, which is almost as bad, to look at home education. Because honestly, the worst thing we can do is let the pagans who are trying to enslave us educate our children, or let's be more honest, indoctrinate our children. It's got nothing to do with education. Education is learning to think critically. Indoctrination is teaching people to just believe what they're told. So it's absolutely vital that we take control of the education of our children, that we become as self-sufficient as possible, have vegetable gardens in your back garden if you can, become self-sufficient in every way, but to think as free people. And this means to investigate and to cut ourselves off from the indoctrination, panic-mongering media that's just slaves of the New World Order. So getting people thinking critically is vital, and helping people see the other side and for people to think critically about, is this really necessary? Can't we do social distancing and hygiene and everything else without government shutdowns? Look at Sweden, look at South Korea, look at Brazil, where they refuse to do these sort of things. Look at countries like Belarus, which have said no, this is like communism, we're not going to do that. So there are cases where there are countries that are managing to deal with the virus without shutting down the economy and committing economic suicide or tearing up the Bill of Rights and putting the people under house arrest. So at this stage, I think we've got to use argument, we've got to use facts, and let's use this as an opportunity to strengthen ourselves, our families, and our links, and to be able to do everything we possibly can to become self-sufficient and especially not dependent on the government for anything.
That's why secession is such an important future for the minority groups in South Africa. There's no question about that. Now, Oscar has asked, can Peter help the South African farmers get the word into the world so they know? I think you already are doing that, aren't you?
I've been trying. We've produced a whole lot of things. Over the years, I've been producing publications like this on South Africa entering the second phase of the revolution and farms and freedoms under fire. And so I write different publications, the false flags and so on. So these people can get on our websites as well. I edit the Christian Action magazines and then the Frontline magazines as well, where we are exposing also done on why black economic empowerment, affirmative action is racism and it's counterproductive and the worst thing that one could do. So there's publication we're doing, and I'm trying to get as much as possible electronically. I've been doing with the Reformation Society for 14 years, Thursday night presentations, and many of these are audio, video, articles. We're building up a great resource for home education and for countering the propaganda of the enemy. So we're busy, and I'm putting a lot of our materials on digitally, home education materials, videos, audios, PowerPoints, SlideShare, you name it, the Podbeans. And I think that if we would use these means and be well networked and be promoting fellow groups that are putting different sides of the puzzle and insights, we don't need to waste any time on CNN, and we know what they're saying. These people are just nothing but disinformation, actually. And I like what George Orwell gave in 1984. The Ministry of Peace runs the war. Yeah. The Ministry of Love deals with the torture. The Ministry of Truth with propaganda and lies. And the Ministry of Plenty, they organize famines and rationing. That's it. That's what governments do. Governments in the New World Order, George Orwell, 1984, Animal Farm type style, what they're involved in doing is just deceiving and enslaving the population. We don't think like free people. We've got to get back to reading real books about real history and training up the next generation not to be slaves, first and foremost in our minds and our spirits, to love freedom, to love a heritage and a history, and to be building a future that's workable. And that's why I think decentralization and secession is the way of the future.
Now, for all those who are watching the video now and watch it later, directly below this video in the description is a link to the latest brochure produced by Frontline Fellowship. It runs to 16 pages, and if you want to see how remarkable the person is, there it is, that I'm talking to right now, Dr. Peter Hammond, just go and read that document. What he is doing around Africa is quite extraordinary. And here you just have a man with a total inspiration, drive, and he's built something quite remarkable. How many thousands of Bibles have you delivered to people in impoverished Africa?
Vastly more than 1 million. If I look at the last 38 years, we've recorded 850,000 Bibles and Christian books in over 24 languages just into Sudan in the last 25 years.
Wow.
That's just Sudan. If I put Angola, Mozambique, Congo, and we're well over the million. In fact, if we just take free literature that goes out from our mission, in the last year, 2019, we distributed over 3 million. Now that includes gospel booklets, which is quite small, but just Bibles alone, hundreds of thousands, easily over the 1 million mark in the last 38 years. And yes, so the digital platforms are increasing, but I still think in Africa the hard copy is most appreciated, and there's a great hunger for literature in Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, now Gordon asked, does Peter agree with the rejoin of the map of South Africa? Obviously you do, but do you want to speak to that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well, first of all, the Zulus 2 years ago celebrated 200 years of the Zulu kingdom, and right. We celebrate with them. I've got many Zulu friends, and good for them. But the Cape has existed for 382 years. We go back a long way, and so why should we in the Cape be backward about the fact that we've had a parliament in Cape Town longer than there has been a dwelling in Johannesburg or Pretoria. Long before the Zulus even thought of being a kingdom or anything like that, the Cape was already a strong civilization and culture of a range, including the Khoisan and the Dutch and the English and the French Huguenots and others coming in. And then we were compelled to be part of a union of South Africa in 1910 by war, by the British, without a referendum, and we don't think it was fair. And we don't see why we need to go down with a ship which has been misrun the rest of the country, when we have proved in the Western Cape that we can do everything well. In fact, in the Western Cape, we pay 5 times more tax than gets spent in our borders. And we're not saying spent well, but we could literally cut our taxes down to 20% if we would secede, for example, because we're paying for the rest of the country. This is a very efficient part of the country. I really believe decentralization is the way to go. I think Switzerland is an excellent success model to follow. So yes, the only hope for South Africa is decentralization. That will resolve a lot of the problems, economically, socially, in every way. We're being mismanaged. This country is not being run by government. It's being run by a criminal element. The ANC is nothing but a criminal mafia who are looting the country and enriching it for themselves, and they're a bunch of murderers, thieves, terrorists, rapists, and others, and I don't think they've got any moral legitimacy, and the only reason why the New World Order doesn't want to admit that is because they're the ones who pushed them into this position. They don't want to admit that they promoted failures like Mugabe.
Right. Now, Willem has written, longest but much more important than anything prior, he's talking about the live stream here tonight. Thank you, Dr. Hammond and Scotty. I think you've bent Reverend Hammond's ear long enough and reschedule another. Well, I certainly would love to reschedule another with Dr. Hammond, but before we close off, because it is getting very late in South Africa now, do you know Michael Cassidy?
I've met him. I know him a little bit, but he's not quite in my circles. He's more in the
Mission
in an ecumenical camp. He would regard me as somewhat of a right-wing extremist, probably, because I would. But I've been at some of his conferences, and he knows me by name, and we've corresponded, and he's even congratulated me and endorsed some of my books. So, but he's far too liberal for us, and we're probably far too conservative for him.
Okay, well, he actually went to my old school, Michael House. And right at the beginning of this live stream, I relate what happened, but I'm not going to repeat it here because it's very interesting. He came and gave a series of lectures at the school when I was there. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd first of all like to thank everybody who's participated in the side stream. I'd like to, in particular, thank the moderators who've been keeping track of what's said and what hasn't said. I'd like to thank everybody who's actually watched the video and those who watch it in the future. Above all, I would like to thank our guest. What an amazing story you have to tell, and I would love to do another live stream with you, and perhaps as Marlena has suggested, Marlena is like my right arm. You know, she does so much work for this channel. She suggests that maybe we can get someone like Hein Marks from ULA and a couple of other of these leaders to come into a live stream with you and have a chat and see if we can get. Oh, what's your cat's name?
This is Olivia. She's wanting to come and join. I've been trying to push her away for a while because I thought that would be distracting, but as we're winding up, it's probably okay to let her come and join. One of my subscribers, Talita, has the most beautiful cats. But anyway, now what I'd like to do, Peter, is ask you. First of all, you're welcome to link this video through your website. So if you like to, just put the link into your websites and people can view this. But what I'd like to do, you might need to share it with me. I wouldn't know where to find it immediately.
Oh, look, I'll send you the link. I'll send it through Skype. And
I'm not a great person.
That's okay. And what I'd really be honored if at the end of this live stream, which has been going for close to 3 hours now, and I really appreciate your time, if you could say a prayer for South Africa.
Yes. Certainly. Shall I do that now?
Yes, please.
Let's pray. Lord God, we thank you that at all times we can turn to you for wisdom, for strength, for grace, for mercy. We need your wisdom, we need your protection, We need your guidance. And we ask, Lord God, that you may mercifully and graciously intervene. There's evil forces at work. There's some evil people at play. There's some evil agendas that are being promoted. Lord, we ask that you'd bring to the light those things which are being hidden, that you'd reveal those traps that are being dug for us, that you'd cause the wicked to condemn themselves by the words of their own mouths. We pray that many who at the moment are deceived to be enlightened and to have their eyes open to the danger that they're in and the deception that's being forced on us from so many different sides. We thank you, Lord, that you have promised us that you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. May you, Lord God, help us to discover the truth, to proclaim the truth, to stand for the truth, to defend it, to not compromise, to contend for the faith once delivered for the saints. And we pray, Lord, that you'd bring many to rise up for you against the wicked, to make a stand against the evildoers. Help us, Lord God, to have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather to expose them. Help us to be salt and light, to preserve what is good and godly and right in our sides, and to shine your light on dark deeds of the wicked, to alert and to protect others. You are a strong fortress, our deliverer, our rock, in whom we trust. We pray, Lord God, that you'd be our shield, that you'd protect us from all evil, that you'd provide what we need, and that you'd guide us in your perfect way. Help us, Lord God, to honor you in what we do. May you deliver South Africa from evil rulers. May you raise up a godly generation who will entrust and elect reliable people who would fear you and serve the people instead of enriching themselves. And Lord, we do pray that those forces working for this decentralization, for independence, for secession, would work together for what is good for the communities and cooperate with their neighbors, that we may be good neighbors, that we may help one another. We thank you for our friends overseas who are speaking up for us. We pray, Lord, that those who've got evil intentions for genocide and for farm invasions would be exposed, frustrated, confounded, and that they'd end up destroying themselves by their own evil machinations. And we pray, Lord, that you'd be a strong deliverer for our farmers who fear you and trust in you. Thank you, Lord, that there are many who love you and are trusting you. Thank you that there's many strong Christians in South Africa and many friends overseas. Help us, Lord God, to win the victory. And we'll give you all honor and praise in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Peter, I just want to say once again, thank you so much. It's been an absolute privilege and an honor to have you on our live stream. I can tell you that everybody is in awe of you. I mean, I can just see it from the side chat. I would certainly, just in closing, say we, as I said before, we would love to have you on another live stream, and I'll ask Marlena to work something out in that score, and perhaps we can do it with a couple of these leaders of other groups, so we can start working towards getting people to work together.
That should be excellent. And of course, by government decree, we all have a little bit more time and a little less mobility, so let's use it.
Absolutely. Alrighty. Thank you guys for joining us tonight. I've had an amazing night speaking to an amazing man who's got so many more stories to tell. You can tell we've only just touched the tip of an iceberg here. And really, I'm in awe. Now, I'm going to sign off and say have a good evening, and please, guys, stay safe. Keep safe, and we'll catch up again. Don't forget, tomorrow night, I'm hoping to speak to Chris Dunn about how his farms in the KwaZulu-Natal area have been occupied illegally by squatters. Cheers, guys. Bye for now.
Thank you so much. God bless.
God bless, Peter.